I know it's a little hard to do things on the run, although maybe you're at home and your refrigerator full. Anyway, we're ready to get started. This is, I think, the presentation a lot of people were sort of eager to get to, at least judging from their questions. We have produced water rules in and out of the oil field with Bill Brankard, Rebecca Roos, Jennifer Redfute, and Daniel Timmons. Bill, if you're ready to go, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Bill Brankard, General Counsel, Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. And I'm going to give a sort of an overview of produced water, although I'm sure folks already know a lot of the details that we've talked a lot about in the last year and a half. And then I'll talk a little bit about House Bill 546 that was passed in 2019, and then go into how our agency regulates, what rules our agency has that affect produced water, and then deal with our current rulemaking that's ongoing, and what were our future actions that we're looking at in dealing with produced water. So if I have a PowerPoint there for somebody to pop up.
Mr. Chair, give us 1 second. The PowerPoint will be up in just a second here.
Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. Most of you are quite familiar probably with a lot of the details about produced water. I'll just go over them pretty quickly. There is a definition of produced water. It is now found in 3 separate statutes: the Oil and Gas Act, Water Quality Act, and the new Produced Water Act. And it's a rather broad definition. Produced water means a fluid that is an incidental byproduct from drilling or the production of oil and gas. In other words, it's water that is co-produced with the hydrocarbons. And then that includes anything that comes back up with the hydrocarbons. So what is produced water? Well, it's primarily what we call formation water, which is the water that exists with the hydrocarbons in the geologic layers that was deposited there eons, hundreds of millions of years ago. And it is extremely salty water as a result. But there's also other water that gets mixed in through the drilling operations. Sometimes we refer to that as flowback water, water that goes down during the drilling and completion phases, and that particularly in the early parts of production comes back up along with the formation water. This water, as I said, is highly saline. In the Permian Basin, produced water is generally saltier than ocean water. That's not true everywhere. In the Northwest, it's a lot less saline. So that's the primary sort of contaminant, as you were. It's salt. But there's also a lot of other stuff in produced water that people are concerned about, and particularly any kinds of chemicals and materials that were introduced during the drilling and completion operations. I say the word completion, but in most modern drilling, that's the fracking part of the operation. These chemicals are in minute quantities, percentage-wise, but they're there. So why do we care about produced water? Well, there's a lot of it. There's always been a lot of it, but now there's even more of it. So 2019, 1.259 billion barrels of produced water. In gallons, that's over 50 billion gallons. That's a lot. But on the other hand, that number has always been large. And looking back at production numbers in the last decade, it's generally around 700 to 800 million barrels a year. So while over the last 3 years, from 2016 to 2019, we saw about a 45% increase in the amount of produced water. During that same time period, we saw a 125% increase in the amount of oil that was produced. I can explain that if you want me to, the difference, but so don't want to hold up here. Where does this produced water go? It is primarily either disposed of or reused within the oil and gas operations. There are two entities here, deep disposal wells and enhanced recovery wells that have the overwhelming majority of produced water goes into those wells. The deep disposal wells, they used to be called saltwater disposal wells, are now down about 15 to 18,000 feet in depth, and they've gotten quite large and handle large quantities of the produced water. Enhanced recovery wells, these are wells in which older oil fields are stimulated to try to get the oil that didn't come out in the initial production phases, and produced water is injected around the production wells and brought up again with the production, moving that oil to the wells to get the last bits of oil out. There is recycling going on within oil and gas operations, in the drilling and completion operations. A lot of water is needed in those operations, particularly in fracking. And so more and more companies are using produced water to displace fresh water in the drilling and completion operations. And so that's where a lot of the water goes also. So next slide. So 2019, the legislature passed House Bill 546, which accomplished a number of actions, and it included the new Produced Water Act that was intended by the sponsors to try to remove obstacles from reuse and recycling of produced water. And so we managed through many changes to that rule, and thanks to the sponsors who were willing to hang in there for a lot of negotiations and changes that it went through. Well, one of the things that was accomplished, which we'll talk about, and so will Rebecca from the Environment Department soon, is that we clearly established administrative authority over the reuse of produced water. Okay, the Oil Conservation Commission, Oil Conservation Division, had the only real statutory authority over produced water, and that covered, prior to House Bill 546, not just reuse and disposal within the oil industry, but also certain reuses outside of the oil field. House Bill 546 cut back on the authority of OCD, OCC, and limited its authority to reuse and disposal within the oil and gas industry. HB 546 then gave explicit authority through the Water Quality Act to the Water Quality Control Commission and the New Mexico Environment Department to regulate all uses and reuses of produced water outside of the oil and gas industry. So now we have a clear dividing line between the agencies to go forward. So, next slide. So this just gives you a little sense of what was done in House Bill 546. Section 70-2-12 is a laundry list of the authorities given to the Oil Conservation Division under the Oil and Gas Act. And one of them dealt with produced water, although they actually didn't use the word produced water. Originally, they used the word water produced. And so this section was significantly clarified, and the language that is highlighted there on the left side is language that shows what the agency had authority of prior to House Bill 546 in terms of uses outside of the oil field. That language is gone in the new version of this paragraph. And so OCC's authority is limited to use and disposal of produced water in exploration, drilling, production, treatment, or refinement of oil and gas. And it's now an explicit reference to the Safe Drinking Water Act, because when we permit disposal wells or even injection wells for enhanced recovery, we're doing it from delegated authority from the US EPA under the Safe Drinking Water. And we've been doing that actually over 35 years. So next slide. So our agency regulates produced water in a number of different ways, and I'm going to touch on some of them here. Trying to deal with how the produced water is handled, how it's disposed of, and if there are any releases and spills, how we deal with those. And I note in here that a number of these rules have been largely rewritten and revised over the last decade, particularly the last few years. Note that going forward here. So storage of produced water, one of the main components of that are impoundments that are located near the oil and gas operations, sometimes lovingly referred to as pits. And so those rules were greatly rewritten about a decade ago with much greater detail about how those impoundments are to be constructed, located, operated, and closed. A lot more detail, way more detail than had previously been found in the agency's rules. But still, the agency sort of, as recycling became more of a possibility for produced water, I think we began to realize that some of these rules perhaps were an impediment to recycling. And so we developed a new rule, or added to an existing rule, 1915-34, to deal with recycling containments, recycling facilities, and the transportation of produced water, that explicitly created the concept of a recycling containment, that is, an impoundment that is designed specifically just for recycling. While on the one hand, none of the technical requirements for impoundments were in any way reduced. They still have to have liners, they still have siting requirements, et cetera, operational requirements, closure requirements. It made the permitting of those a lot simpler, in hopefully to encourage the recycling facilities to be built. So that was completed in 2015. And so then the other primary area that we deal with are injection wells, which, as I said, either as they're used for disposal or for reuse and enhanced recovery, is the overwhelming majority of the disposition of produced water. We have a rule, 1915-26, that deals with both disposal wells and enhanced recovery wells. We made some small adjustments to the rule in 2018. A lot of other changes are needed, and I'll talk about that later. Those rules are done under the authority of the Safe Drinking Water Act. We have to get those rules approved by EPA every time we revise them. And so that's our delegated authority from EPA to protect safe drinking water sources with injection. Spills and cleanups, we have two rules. One's called a sort of a release rule, one's a remediation rule. Basic difference between Rule 29 and 30. Rule 29 essentially deals with all releases, but if you have a more significant contamination, particularly anything that is impacting groundwater, you move to Rule 30 and the remediation plans there, which are similar to abatement plans under the Water Quality Control Commission. Rule 29 was completely rewritten in 2018, and it dealt with problem that we had where essentially the rule required that after you reported a release to the agency, you were then told to develop a cleanup plan in accordance with the agency. And that was it, no details. So the 2018 rule change goes on in significant detail of the steps that an operator must take once they have a release, the steps they must take immediately to prevent any further movement of the materials. If they can clean it up immediately, great. If not, then there are steps about how to characterize the contamination, and then a whole remediation plan phase that goes along with it. So a lot more detail, a lot more direction to the companies about what they do once they have a release and how they get it cleaned up. So next. The next two slides show some of these recycling, just pictures of these recycling containments that exist today. You know, it's sort of silly to call them pits because they're huge. And as you can see, these are lined containments here, generally double line containments with leak detection systems. They cover a fair amount of acreage. And the next slide is a recycling facility that shows that there's a series of ponds that a company will use, or a midstream company will use, with both dealing with the produced water and any other water that they want to mix in and for further drilling operations. Next. So where are we today? Our agency and the Environment Department sort of embarked on an effort after House Bill 546 was passed to do public outreach and to begin work on proposed rule changes dealing with House Bill 546. Rebecca will cover more of the public outreach that the Environment Department took the lead on, and our agency and the Office of State Engineer participated in those public sessions across the state. We decided to be the first one out of the box with making rule changes in regard to House Bill 546 because we had existing rules in place that essentially were now in conflict with the language in House Bill 546. So in other words, our rules dealt with the old regime, which allowed us to approve reuses outside of the oil industry in other ways. Those references to those authorities in our rules, particularly Rule 34, and we felt the need to, first of all, let's clean that up. Let's get rid of these conflicts that we have in our rules and make it clear what the current regime is in terms of agency authority over this. And then we can work from there with the Environment Department on more specific rules dealing with produced water and the handling of reused produced water. So the current rulemaking, we had hearings at the end of July, I believe, and just this morning, the Oil Conservation Commission met and approved these rule changes. We had some significant public input, industry input into the draft rules and rule proposals during the hearing. The Commission adopted a number of changes suggested by other parties along with the agency to sort of clarify the agency's authority, what it is and what it isn't. The one thing that was done in addition to clarifying the agency's authority is that we needed to get a grip on just how much of the water that's being used in drilling and completion operations is recycled, or what source is it coming from. We don't have any current way of doing that. We could have just put it in a form, but we thought it'd be better to put it in a rule. Right now, we get from forms that are filed with the Frac Focus organization the total amount of water that is used in hydraulic fracturing at a particular well. But where that water comes from, we don't know. We have anecdotal evidence. Companies have told us that they're doing recycling or they're using brackish water instead of drinking water, but we don't really know. And I think one of the questions that was raised earlier by one of the legislators is there a need to regulate in this area? And we thought we ought to at least get some data before we jumped into regulating. So after the hearings, the commission looked at our proposal and then added in some additions that other parties had. And so now when a company files its forms showing how they completed the well, you now have to show the amount of water, which you have already will be reporting on your fracture disclosure form, and then break that down into 4 categories. Water that has less than 1,000 total dissolved solids, that's pretty usable water. Water that's between 1,000 and 10,000, I call that brackish water. Water that's greater than 10,000, which is very brackish. And then how much of it is recycled produced water. So we get a sense of what is being used in drilling and completion and whether there's a need for further actions in that regard. So finally, the last slide. As I mentioned, we will continue to work with the New Mexico Environment Department as they move ahead also with rulemaking ideas. We want to, as was expressed earlier in our efforts with methane rulemakings, to make sure that what we're doing and what the Environment Department is doing works together, that we're not conflicting with each other, we're not at cross purposes. And so that's a pretty important effort on both agencies' part. But I think there are certain areas where we can move ahead on our own. And so we're looking at a few of those. One of our big concerns for a number of years has been the injection wells, which are absorbing maybe half or more of this quantity of produced water that you see. That's a lot of water going down these deep wells. And as a result, we've seen a significant increase in the number of applications for these disposal wells in the last few years. We're also seeing these wells become bigger. The well bores are increasing. Therefore, the volume of water going down one of these wells at any one time is increasing. The wells have gotten much deeper, and part of that is our encouragement to the companies to go deeper to get not only away from any drinking water sources, but way away even from areas where there's any oil and gas production that could be interfered with. And so it's a much more complicated scenario now with these wells, and our regulations are rather sparse in this regard, and we clearly need, and so is our permits, so we clearly need to develop more detail as we go forward. One of the concerns that has happened in other states, but luckily, and we think we take a little bit of credit for that, we have seen very little of it in New Mexico, is induced seismicity. Disposal wells, because of the amount of water they are re-injecting into geologic layers, if they are in contact with fault zones, deep basement rock, they can cause slippage, can cause sort of minor earthquake events. Oklahoma obviously is sort of the case in point, where a state went from having, say, 2 earthquakes a year, 3.0 or higher, to over 900 in 2015. And it was pretty securely linked to disposal wells. Texas has also had a slew and is still having a slew of minor seismic activities. We had a little bit here about a decade ago in an area outside of Carlsbad. And our geologists have greatly encouraged the companies to use certain geologic layers for disposal that we think will have the least risk of seismicity. And it seems to have paid off very well for us. But I think we still remain concerned, particularly given the volumes that are now being injected in the close proximity of a lot of the proposals that we have of wells near each other, which concerns us. So we're working with New Mexico Tech. We have funded them to do additional seismic work in the Permian Basin. And so that's a great partnership that we have. Hopefully, getting more information from that. We have developed a more detailed permit for our wells, and we're getting near to going public with that. That has a lot of requirements and gives us the ability to step in if there are events that could cause problems, which our prior permits didn't. And we're working on a larger project to revise our injection rule to give us those authorities and to deal with other issues related to these newer, deeper wells, including financial assurance, bonding for these wells. Other than that, we have a number of other ideas that we're looking at in terms of produced water, other facilities that possibly need to have more standards associated with them, flow lines, tank batteries, et cetera. And so those are sort of on the list of rule changes that we are considering as we find time in our days here. And finally, we've gotten through House Bill 546, Administrative Enforcement Authority to the agency, and we're going to be working on that to increase our authority over companies that fail to bond properly, fail to follow the requirements for injection wells, fail to follow up on remediating spills and releases. And I've probably gone way over my time, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bill. Generally, we just go in order of the agenda. Next up, we have Rebecca Roos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, members of the committee. I'll introduce myself as staff there are pulling up my presentation to display. I'm the Director of the Water Protection Division at the New Mexico Environment Department. Can you hear me okay so far?
Yes.
Great. So I'm pleased to be here today to provide an update on the efforts at the Environment Department around implementation of the Produced Water Act. So I'll provide some updates on where we are on rulemaking and some of our other very important activities that we've stepped into with both feet since the Produced Water Act went into effect last summer. Next slide. As Bill from EMNERD just covered, when we at the Environment Department are looking at produced water, we are focusing on the jurisdiction and authority provided to us through the Produced Water Act. And that means we're looking exclusively at treatment and use of produced water for purposes outside the oil and gas sector. That includes some of the examples that Bill showed of the prior version of the statute for OCD jurisdiction that included road construction, industrial use, energy production, things like that. There's a range of possibilities outside the oil and gas. In and of itself is a very broad statement. I'll talk a little bit more about some scope aspects of that as we continue. The statute requires the Environment Department as a constituent agency of the Water Quality Control Commission to draft regulations to present to the Commission that address the discharge, handling, transport, storage, and recycling or treatment of produced water or byproducts outside of the oil field. So that's the charge. Next slide. We at the Environment Department develop a lot of regulations that are presented to the Water Quality Control Commission under the Water Quality Act, especially, and some of our authorities through Clean Water Act delegated programs for our standards program, surface water standards. And so we're accustomed at the Environment Department to some of the key requirements in the Water Quality Act for the Commission to consider when adopting regulations. And we include this to show, at least at a glance, some of the rigor that is involved in a rulemaking process through the Water Quality Control Commission. And any regulations that the Environment Department were to draft and go through a public process even before petitioning the commission, we would be considering all of these factors, public interest, technical aspects, economic aspects, feasibility, of course, environmental protection, natural resource protection, public health protection, and other considerations. So that's a framing in terms of the rigor. And as we at the department looked at the charge given to us by the legislature in HB 546, we started thinking about what do we need to do? Where are we in terms of an understanding of off-field treatment and reuse of produced water? And what work do we need to do along the way to actually meet this charge of preparing rigorous and protective proposed regulations under the authority given to us for outside the oil field. Next slide. So this brings me to the brief update on where we are with our rulemaking process. In part because of what I was just saying, sort of us taking inventory on what do we know, what do we need to know to be able to move forward with protective regulations. We early on sort of started seeing our rulemaking effort falling into two phases, near term and much longer term. In the near term, we are looking at potentially putting forward a narrow rulemaking that clearly in the regulations, in the administrative code, establishes a prohibition on untreated produced water use outside the oil and gas industry. And at the same time that we could do a rulemaking with that narrow scope prohibition, we're also looking at our existing authorities and whether or not that's an opportunity for us in that phase one rulemaking to also take action to make sure that we're increasing the amount of information that is available to the Environment Department about the chemical constituents in produced water. As a regulatory agency, we have to know what we're regulating. And there's a lot of information known about what constituents are in produced water that's generated in the state of New Mexico, but there are a number of unknowns as well. And so we're taking a close look at that, understanding that we are going to have an obligation, a need to know what is in the produced water. And so we're taking a look to see if there's regulatory action in the near term to increase that flow of information to the department. The timeline for this is 2020 to 2021. This is something we've been thinking about. We've started working on it in 2020, and it'll continue into 2021. And right now we don't have a more specific timeline, in part because of some shifting sands over the last 6 months or so, both with respect to the demands on the department, as we have, like all of our sibling agencies, navigated the changing demands this year through the pandemic. But another key factor is our resources. Coming out of the regular session, many of you on the committee may recall, we had requested 2 additional FTE for the department to work on produced water, and we were happy to see that pass in the regular session. And unfortunately, those 2 positions were some of the casualties of the special session, and we understand the need to obviously absorb some cuts through the special session given the circumstances in the state with budgets. But that is a new factor for us to consider in terms of the reasonable pace for us to move, given that our existing resources in both our surface water program and our groundwater program, who are actively working on produced water, are really fully extended, even outside of any rulemaking efforts that we do on produced water. So we hope in the future to have a more specific timeline for that near-term rulemaking, but we do certainly expect that we'll be working on that through at least well into 2021. In phase 2, we will shift to more specific regulations to ensure that any treated produced water that is going to be used for any purpose outside the oil and gas field will comport with necessary and appropriate science-based regulations around surface water quality standards, groundwater quality standards, record keeping, reporting, enforcement authorities, all of those considerations to really stand up a produced water regulatory program that the Environment Department does not currently have. We say over time and as science dictates because it's essential that these regulations be science-based. And we have identified, we knew early on that there are a number of critical science and technology gaps when we get into off-field, outside the oil and gas field uses of produced water. So this timeline is TBD, and we'll go to the next couple of slides, which will flesh it out a little bit more, what happens in the meantime. For one thing, we are very committed and focused on public engagement and targeted tribal outreach. We, as Bill Brancard mentioned, invested heavily in that effort last fall. We were glad to have the Office of the State Engineer and EMNERD with us on the road for 5 public meetings around the state. We gathered a significant amount of input through those meetings in person and through an email list we created and other methods for the public to communicate with us on this topic, and really engaged in a two-way information exchange. Us at the state agencies sharing information about produced water and the Produced Water Act and what implementation might entail, and the public sharing their concerns, their ideas, and input on how they think produced water should be managed in the state, what research is needed, and things of that sort. Coming out of those meetings, we've generated 2 documents now. That frequently asked questions document has been available since January. It's a really handy resource. It's actually has a number of questions that are organized by the 3 state agencies that I mentioned. It kind of hit some of the key basics and some of the questions that came up again and again during those public meetings. And then just this week, we finalized and published on our website a summary of initial public input that covers over 760 different communications to the department about produced water. And we reviewed them, really took a close look, organized them around themes. It is not a comment response document, because again, this was not a rulemaking process, but that is a great resource to, if anyone is interested in understanding what the public perspectives and input around produced water is, that's a great resource that's now available. And the other big area of focus and investment for us at the Environment Department is in science and innovation. And so last summer, as we were taking a look at the provisions of 546 and what it meant for us at the agency, we reached out to New Mexico State University. We actually had some great collaborators to help us make that connection and launched the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium last fall. An initial kickoff and announcement in the October timeframe, and then the consortium really started forming and meeting and doing work in January of this year. So we're now about...
Excuse me, I'd like to interrupt for just a second. I'm sort of watching the clock, and I'm concerned about the time. I know we're going to have some questions, and we do still have 2 more speakers. So if we could just sort of pick up the pace a little, and maybe if you could bring your presentation to a close in the near future, that'd be great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's no problem. I can absolutely wrap up. So there's a lot more happening there with the consortium that we can go into in Q&A if needed. And next slide, and that's my last one. We get the next slide. I'll start talking about it as we go. This just lists a few of the questions that at a very high level that we're thinking of when we talk about science and technology gaps. What's in the water? How can it be treated? How do we know what the the analytics are, and do we have methods to measure it? And then based on those pieces of information, what changes do we need to make to our state water quality standards to protect water resources and human health? So those are some of the big framing questions that are in play right now as we think about down the road moving into that phase 2 rulemaking. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And you were almost done. I interrupted you, so I apologize about that. We do still have 2 more speakers. And next up, we have Jennifer Bradfute. Jennifer, if you're there, take it away.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I do not have a slide presentation to share with you today. I've prepared comments, and then I also have one of my colleagues with me, Carrie Hartpool, who's available to answer technical questions during the Q&A portion of this session. I really greatly appreciate the opportunity to provide remarks today to this committee. My name is Jennifer Bradfute, and I am a senior attorney for Marathon Oil Company. Marathon is an independent exploration and production company that is based in Houston, Texas. However, we have a field office in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and we primarily focus on horizontal development, and we're active in shale plays located in the Eagle Ford Basin in Texas, the Bakken Basin in North Dakota, the Stack Scoop Basins in Oklahoma, and the Permian Basin, with a sliver of our interests located in Texas, but the majority of our Permian Basin interests located in New Mexico. I'm a native New Mexican, and I work out of Albuquerque, and I am very proud to work for Marathon, and I'm also proud about my involvement in the development of the Produced Water Act during the 2019 legislative session. I thought it might be helpful for the committee to quickly go over some of the key priorities in that legislation for myself when I was working on the bill. The intent, first and foremost, in the Produced Water Act was to help conserve freshwater resources in New Mexico. And so the goal was finding a way to incentivize companies to invest in infrastructure to promote recycling. The bill was designed to primarily encourage recycling of produced water in the oil field. We discussed and created a regulatory authority, a statutory basis for regulatory authority in the bill for future uses, but we also put some very strict parameters in the legislation as protective measures. And we did that because the goal was to focus on those in oil field uses. And I think a lot of the conversation after the 2019 session focused on out of oil field uses, but I really want to make clear to the committee that the main intent was to encourage recycling within the oil and gas field, within oil and gas operations. We found that there were some legal barriers to investment in infrastructure in New Mexico. And in response to a question that was raised earlier in one of the earlier sessions, some of those legal barriers still exist, which may require the use of fresh water in legal situations, not in a physical engineering type of situation. So you got kind of the engineering response earlier, but prior to 2019, many surface owners in southeastern New Mexico and probably in northern New Mexico entered into surface use agreements with oil and gas operators, which are covenants that run with the land. And as provisions to those surface use agreements, they required the operators who operated on their land to purchase fresh water from them for their oil and gas operations. Those contracts are valid binding agreements. In the originally proposed legislation, we tried to propose creative ways around that to promote the use of recycled water. But the feedback that we got from others was the fact that we would be asking the legislature to create a law that impaired existing contractual agreements between private parties. So that is one barrier that does still exist under the law. We would definitely be open to discussing options to help operators move forward and use more recycled water. As stated by Mr. Brankard and Director Roos, the bill created clear jurisdictional authority, and we wanted there to be solid regulatory authority over produced water uses. We wanted there to be a solid line of authority for in oil field uses. And then we saw a long list, or a very broad list, of potential out of oil field uses that were supposed to be regulated by the Oil Conservation Division under the Oil and Gas Act. As Mr. Brinkard mentioned, we eliminated those uses from the Oil and Gas Act, and we created regulatory jurisdiction under NMED after rules are promulgated by the Water Quality Control Commission for out of the oil field uses. But we also put in an additional protective measure that is something that oftentimes isn't mentioned. We put an express provision in the Produced Water Act that requires anybody who wants to use treated produced water outside of the oil field to get a permit from the Environment Department. And obviously, if the Environment Department doesn't have a mechanism to create or give a permit, nobody could comply with that statutory requirement. So it creates a hard stop. Until the Environment Department is ready to give a scientifically based permit, there isn't a mechanism for private parties, for any parties, to use recycled or treated produced water out of the oil field. I wanted to talk about some of the successes and wins under the Produced Water Act after its enactment. There have been several. There's been several significant investment announcements that have been made by companies about their desire to invest in infrastructure in New Mexico, which was exactly what the bill was created to achieve. In July of 2019, Solaris Water Midstream announced that its Lobo Ranch Produced Water Recycling and Blending Center in Eddy County was being developed. It also announced that it intended to develop another facility, the Bronco facility in Lee County. Today, the Lobo facility is operational, and it consists of a 300-mile water gathering, disposal, and supply system that aggregates produced water from nearly 20 different oil and gas operators. Demand for the recycled produced water from that facility is growing, and that facility can process up to 80,000 barrels of recycled produced water a day. One customer alone so far has purchased 16 million barrels of recycled water last year, according to the company. In July of this year, Solaris announced an expansion accommodating, it's going to operate one of the operators in New Mexico's 2.3 million area acre for the purpose of recycling more water that's obtained from that area in Lee County, in both Eddy and Lee County. Antelope Water Management, LLC, announced in July of 2019 that it had entered into agreements and created 2 new subsidiaries, Enchantment Water Management and Antelope Water Services, to create recycling facilities in southeastern New Mexico. In November of 2019, OWL, which is primarily a disposal-focused company, announced plans for a 540-acre produced water treatment facility in Lee County. This year, Goodnight Midstream, a leading produced water midstream infrastructure company, which primarily has focused its operations in the Bakken and in the Midland Basin and Eagle Ford Basin in Texas, has announced plans to enter the Delaware Basin in New Mexico and develop infrastructure. They've announced plans to develop infrastructure that could take 700,000 barrels per day of throughput from operations in southeast New Mexico. In addition to encouraging recycling of oil field produced water, the Produced Water Act has also generated conversations with other types of wastewater generators, such as municipalities. The city of Lubbock has recently entered into an agreement with Palisade Pipeline to develop a 100-mile long pipeline transporting wastewater from the municipality from Texas into New Mexico that could be recycled and reused for oil and gas operations. So recycling wastewater is not going to be a limited concept in New Mexico. And for oil and gas operations, that's a good fit. That is conserving freshwater resources for other uses like agriculture within the state. This year, Wood Mackenzie issued a report, and they said so far in 2020, companies have made more than $2.5 billion of water-related mergers, acquisitions, private equity investments, and other deals related to oil field water handling. That's phenomenal. And the vast majority of those investments have been focused on the Permian Basin. And many of those investments would not have happened but for the incentives created in the Produced Water Act and the conversation that was started around the importance of wanting to recycle and reuse produced water in oil and gas operations. I'm also personally aware of numerous companies who have engaged with New Mexico agencies starting to bring their ideas about wanting to recycle their own water from their operations and reuse it in their own completions operations. As EOG mentioned, oil and gas operators continue to make substantial investments in their own recycling infrastructure. And as Director Roos mentioned, another huge development since the enactment of the Produced Water Act is the creation of the Produced Water Consortium between New Mexico State University and the Environment Department, the state of New Mexico. Under that consortium, the university, NMSU, New Mexico State University, has gained significant funding. They've obtained private funding from industry members totaling over $1 million for their research efforts. And they have become competitive because New Mexico has been seen as a leader in this area to obtain federal funding from the Department of Energy. And they were one of several universities who were awarded a major federal grant to continue their research projects. One key that I want to kind of drive home is that these investments are happening in the midst of a very volatile oil and gas market. So while you see companies starting to move rigs out of the state and withdraw capital investment, you still see water handling companies interested in moving forward with some of these investments. But in a volatile market, you're going to see that these plans, these construction plans, are going to take a little bit longer to come to fruition. So the take home is we see huge investments in the state of New Mexico, particularly in southeastern New Mexico, in recycling infrastructure. But it may take a little bit of time for those build outs to be finalized. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Next up, we have Daniel Timmons, and we are again tight on time. So if you could be direct, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Daniel Timmons, and I'm a staff attorney with Wild Earth Guardians here in Santa Fe. So I'll just cut straight to the chase. To begin, the unprecedented fracking boom in recent years has come at a heavy cost, as New Mexico has been flooded with oil and gas waste. According to NMED, in the Permian Basin, 4 to 7 barrels of liquid waste, aka produced water, are generated for every single barrel of oil. No doubt, finding a way to safely reuse 160,000 acre-feet of oil and gas waste could be great for New Mexico. But before we leap to reuse of oil and gas waste, we must better understand what we're talking about. So to start, we must recognize that produced water is fundamentally fracking waste, not water. And right now, there are huge gaps in the scientific understanding of the toxicity and the risks associated with this waste. So let's start with what we know. Produced water contains high levels of corrosive salts, heavy metals, and a slew of toxic chemicals known to have significant impacts on human health, causing cancer, endocrine disruption, and premature death. Even more concerning is that oil and gas waste, including produced water, is often radioactive, with the EPA confirming the presence of radium, radon, uranium, potassium, and thorium, all in produced water. Produced water from the Permian Basin has specifically been shown to contain, quote, significant levels of uranium. It's been said that all oil field workers are radiation workers. They just don't know it. What we know about produced water is scary enough, but even more troubling is what we don't know, because the toxicity of the vast majority of the chemicals found in produced water has simply never been studied. One recent report found that 86% of more than 1,000 chemicals detected in produced water do not have established toxicity thresholds. That means we don't know what's safe. So how can we regulate what we don't understand? Now, the legislature understood some of these challenges when it passed the Produced Water Act, directing OCD to promulgate rules to assure protection of public health, the environment, and freshwater resources. And to help tackle the problem of huge amounts of precious fresh water being used by the industry, the Act attempted to draw that jurisdictional line between the reuse of produced water and oil and gas activities regulated by OCD and its potential reuse for other purposes to be regulated by the Water Quality Control Commission. But that jurisdictional line between New Mexico's oil fields and New Mexican communities is not so clear on the ground. On January 21st of this year, a family home in Otis was drenched after a produced water pipe burst. As recently reported, Penny O'Coin's chickens are all dead. Her dog is dead, euthanized after being exposed to toxic produced water. The family has been advised by county officials not to eat anything grown on their property. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, how would you feel if you could no longer safely eat the food grown on your own land? Under the Produced Water Act, that exploded pipeline was an oil field pipeline, but that jurisdictional distinction provided no protection for Penny and her family. Explosions, spills, and leaks. That is the cost of business as usual right now in New Mexico. OCD records show more than 7,000 produced water spills since July 2010. And just this year, there have already been more than 450 new ones, including more than 230 major spills. That's a major spill nearly every day, spilling 1.7 million gallons of toxic waste across New Mexican lands just this year. And OCD does not prohibit these spills. Mr. Brancard mentioned OCD's cleanup standards, but after the fact cleanup isn't good enough. Moreover, OCD rules cover only a narrow range of the toxic chemicals found in produced water and don't require complete cleanup, even of those few chemicals that are covered. And they require no radiation testing or cleanup. These disasters should be preventable. But with routine spills, leaks, and explosions, it's clear that the current deregulatory approach to produced water within the industry is not meeting the legislature's objective of protecting public health and the environment. And if the industry cannot safely manage its own waste, how can we begin to consider other uses? Industry has characterized produced water as an opportunity, a game changer for New Mexico, pushing our state to be at the forefront of oil and gas waste reuse. But the public is unconvinced and urges legislators to consider the serious risks associated with leading the way on an industry-backed push to rebrand its toxic waste as an opportunity to be exploited, a commodity to be profited from. Fresh water in New Mexico is our most precious resource, besides our people. While opening up a whole new category of water is certainly appealing, there is simply no indication that produced water can ever be made safe for use outside the industry. The salinity alone of produced water in the Permian Basin, much saltier than seawater, makes potential treatment incredibly difficult and costly. Not to mention the potentially toxic chemicals, many shielded from public knowledge. And then there's the radioactivity, which traditional treatment technologies simply do not address. Just recently, researchers from Duke University found the discharge of treated produced water from municipal wastewater plants has caused the accumulation of radioactive materials in stream sediments in Pennsylvania up to 650 times natural background levels. There is simply no scientific evidence that produced water can ever be made safe for reuse outside the oil and gas industry. So to close, I want to offer several suggestions for how the legislature can take action to ensure that the underlying intent of the Produced Water Act can be realized, minimizing the industry's outsized impact on scarce freshwater resources while protecting public health and the environment. First, we have to close the loopholes. Oil and gas waste, including produced water, is currently exempt from regulation as hazardous waste under federal law and the New Mexico Hazardous Waste Act. Not because it's not toxic, but because there's just so much of it. but the abundance of this toxic waste should be a call to action, not an excuse for burying our collective heads in the sand. So we asked the legislature to eliminate the exemption for oil and gas waste, including produced water, in New Mexico Statute 74-4-3. This is not to single out or raise the bar for oil and gas. It's just making this industry play by the same rules as everyone else and ensuring that toxic, hazardous waste is treated as such, regardless of the political power of the industry that generates it. As to the potential for safe reuse of produced water outside of oil and gas, to be blunt, we think it's a fool's errand. But for any chance of safely reusing produced water off the oil fields, it's clear that NMED, particularly the Water Quality Control Commission, cannot go it alone. Because produced water does not just threaten water quality, it also threatens human health. So to start, the legislature should direct the Occupational Safety and Health Commission to adopt regulations to ensure worker safety, particularly in light of the radiation threat posed by produced water. The legislature should direct the Transportation Commission to adopt rules ensuring the safe transport of produced water on New Mexico's roads and highways, on and off the oil field. And before produced water is even considered for use in agriculture, critical stakeholders would need to be consulted to ensure adequate safeguards, including the Agriculture Department, the Soil and Water Conservation Commission, the Acequia Association, the Farm Bureau, and the dairy producers. Wild Earth Guardians appreciates the challenge posed by the vast amounts of produced water generated by the state's oil and gas industry. And we appreciate the legislative attempt through the Produced Water Act to promote conservation of fresh water through recycling and reuse within the industry, and to do so in a manner that's protective of public health, the environment, and fresh water. Going forward, we hope to be of service in ensuring this legislative intent and the promise of the Produced Water Act is fulfilled. And I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I appreciate that. We're going to go to the committee. We have a few on the list already. I know I have some questions myself. I do ask you to keep your questions sort of short and direct. If the answers could also be short and direct, I suspect we're going to run over a little. I'd like to limit how much we run over as a courtesy to those that are coming after us, or after this presentation. So first on our list, we have Senator Cedillo-Lopez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you much for those presentations. They were really helpful, and I particularly like the clarification of the purpose of the Produced Water Act is to protect the water and to protect air and health. But I'm concerned by the extremely high number of spills of produced water and crude oil that are self-reported by the oil and gas industry. There were thousands of spills alone. What are the consequences for these spills? What are, I didn't hear anybody talk about, are there fines? What happens after one of these spills? Is just a plan to correct it? And then if they don't correct it, what?
Thank you for the question, Senator. As of today, there is no prohibition on spills of produced water under OCD's rules. Yesterday, actually, Guardians filed a petition for rulemaking with the Oil Conservation Commission to fill that regulatory gap and to propose that a ban on produced water spills be enforced and provide OCD with the enforcement authority to actually enforce that. But as of now, there is no penalty for spilling produced water in New Mexico. My understanding from speaking with Mr. Brancard and OCD is that there are penalties potentially for failure to report or inadequate cleanups, but spilling itself is not prohibited.
So I appreciate that. And you stated, or I don't know, does anybody, Mr. Chair, I don't know if anybody else wants to answer that. Then,
Mr. Chair, Senator Cedillo-Lopez, Mr. Timmons is somewhat correct, but yes, there are very strict deadlines for reporting a spill, strict deadlines for then taking action in a series of steps after that. And any one of the failures to meet those deadlines is a potential notice of violation and administrative penalties.
Notice of violation and administrative penalty, which includes what?
Those were the penalty amounts that were put in House Bill 546 by the legislature, $2,500 a day, up to $200,000. Those are the caps that the legislature put on.
Okay, so that's the consequence. You stated, and this actually, well, I believe it was Mr. Brancard that stated that the produced water is highly saline, but it also includes hydrocarbons, I think you said, and then you said other chemicals. What kinds of chemicals are there, and what other things are there, and how are they regulated, these things?
Mr. Chair, Senator Cedillo Lopez, yes, the salinity is the main component of solids that are in produced water. Like I said, it's saltier than ocean water in southeast New Mexico. In the early stages of production from a well, you're going to get flowback also from the drilling and completion efforts. So any of the chemicals that are used in drilling and in completion, minute amounts of that would come back in the produced water also. There's a number of chemicals that the companies use to assist them in the drilling and to assist the fracking. So you'll see more of that coming back up with the water.
So I believe it's some of those contaminants are ethylbenzene, toluene, xylenes, methylene chloride, formaldehyde, polycyclide, hydrocarbons, radon, and other volatile organic compounds. Does NMED, I believe this is for Mrs. Roos, regulate any of those compounds?
Mr. Chair, Senator Cedillo Lopez, yes, we do regulate some of them in our existing groundwater standards and our existing surface water standards. Though we know that there are chemical constituents in produced water that are not currently covered in our standards, and our standards haven't been developed with this particular industry in mind and with the wastewater from this industry in mind. So that's why we're really taking our time and making sure we build the scientific basis and understand not just what's in it, but what methods are available to test for these chemicals and what would reasonable or appropriate standards be to adopt as modifications of our existing water quality standards.
So, I mean, because one of those is radiation, right? And I believe it was Mr. Simmons who said that radioactivity is a problem in other states, and he described horrific. I thought that the stream beds had I believe he said 600 times the radiation. What's the evidence that radioactivity is a problem here, and who would regulate radioactivity in this water?
Mr. Chair, Senator Cedillo Lopez, very brief response to that is yes, radioactivity in produced water is a significant concern. The Environment Department agrees with that wholeheartedly. There are other waste streams in the state that we already regulate that are outside of the oil and gas industry where radioactivity is also a concern, and it is something that we address in other sectors through our groundwater discharge permitting program, abatement for when there is spills or contamination, and so on. So it's a concern. It would be, I can't foresee exactly how the NMED regulations through the commission will manifest for all of the aspects of our phase 2 area of rulemaking. But certainly we would be needing to establish water quality standards and implementing regulatory mechanisms to impose those. And then also could be looking at other authorities within the department that are necessary to cover all of the bases with respect to any particular off-field use that might down the road be scientifically supported.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
Mr. Chair and Senator Cedillo Lopez, one point I just wanted to add is the definition of produced water is intentionally broad. And so the treated produced water is something that the Environment Department has jurisdiction under as a matter of statute under the Produced Water Act. And that has a broad realm of not just the water fluids, but the other fluids included in the water as well.
Yes, thank you. And then this is a confusion for me. Again, and you said that the state engineer's office did go on the tour that you described and was part of the rulemaking. But how is it that brackish water is this? I'm trying to understand the relationship between all the agencies. How is it that brackish water is exempt from regulation by the state engineer? And then this act creates a possessory interest in this water. So where is the state engineer's role? I've heard stories about water transfers that should have been approved by the state engineer's office that weren't approved. And so I'm confused. Where does the regulation of the quantity of the water kick in?
Mr. Chair and Senator Cedillo Lopez, I think I would need more background and more details to accurately respond to your question. I do know that the provision that you're talking about in the Produced Water Act was language that was given by the Office of the State Engineer and their general counsel.
I understand that, and it cuts them out. So it worries me, and I know they don't have enough resources, because one of the purposes of this act is to preserve fresh water and drinking water. And I think that sort of cutting them out, at least that's how it appears to me, is problematic. And then this actually leads to my final question. I think it's really, Mr. Blanchard talked about that now they're going to, that the new rules, well, actually there's two questions in this, but the new rules have two pieces to them that was of interest. One of them is the question of the jurisdiction question, that within industry, OCD would regulate it, and outside of industry, the environmental department would regulate it. How can you figure out where that line is? I was just thinking about that family where WPX dumped at least 13 barrels or about 500 gallons on that family, on that land. I believe that you would say that the leak or the pipeline explosion or whatever was within the industry, but the consequences of that was outside on private land. And as far as I'm aware, they haven't had any kind of consequence, no fine, no anything that I've heard of for that massive spill that killed their chickens and otherwise really destroyed their farm. And my understanding also is there was no reclamation. They just took this topsoil off and told them not to grow anything. So saying that, who, making that point, then who would regulate? Whose jurisdiction is that?
Mr. Chair and Senator Cedillo Lopez, I'm really glad you brought that up, because there actually is language in the Produced Water Act that does address part of the answer to that situation. Obviously, I don't have all of the facts, and the lawyer in me likes to have all the facts before I state something. But in Section 4, subsection B, there's a provision in there where the liability limitations listed in that section between private parties don't apply to persons who suffered damages for personal injury, property damage arising from exposure to produced water. So first and foremost, there's liability there under the express terms of the Produced Water Act, and somebody could pursue legal remedies there. And then also private parties can always contact the Oil Conservation Division, and Mr. Brankard would be the expert in that area.
I totally understand that. I believe there is some kind of litigation being contemplated, but that's the private sector regulating industry instead of having some kind of consequence for this massive spill that was so destructive. And I don't think that the current regulations make that clear. I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that, Mr. Chair.
Senator Cedillo Lopez, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I mean, I think that there still will be a little bit of gray area between the agencies, but there was a lot of gray area before House Bill 546. And so, it depends on the uses of the water, which agency controls. In this case, when you're dealing with uses of the water within the oil field industry, that's the Oil Conservation Division that handles that and would handle overseeing any kind of reclamation of the spills and releases.
Okay. And I think that is going to be an interesting, I hope that there's the same collaboration. Then I'm kind of concerned also because I don't understand these regulations or the statute to require that the source of the water, I know that Mr. Blanchard just said that now they'd have to identify the type of water, whether it was recycled or whether it was fresh and whether it was brackish. But where did they get that water? Then which well ends up producing the produced water? Then monitoring the transportation of this toxic waste, and then its ultimate disposition. Is that monitored? So that I know that liability, I know that this kind of answered by this possessory interest kind of thing, but I don't understand how you can really figure out who did it if these kinds of records are not kept.
Senator Cedillo Lopez, I think that's a fantastic question and a real regulatory gap here. There is no cradle to grave tracking system in place for produced water under New Mexico. If New Mexico regulated produced water like a hazardous waste under the New Mexico Hazardous Waste Act, that type of tracking would be in place. So that's why we urge the legislature to remove the exemption for oil and gas waste and treat it like every other hazardous waste.
I actually have some more questions, but in the interest of not dominating this, I'll go ahead and move on. That's it, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Next up, we have Representative Small. I would say to the members, we have 4 panelists. Please feel free to direct your questions to a particular panelist if that's your desire to hear one perspective or another. And I'm fine with more than one panelist answering, and I think the questioner can pretty much, take it upon themselves to direct that. So I'm fine with that. We are over time. We do still have questions, and I think this is an important topic today. So I think we should keep going. Representative Small.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of the 4 panelists, and I will work to be brief. Mr. Chair, panelists, the first, I guess I would direct the question first to Mr. Brankard, but Mr. Brankard, you detailed some of the potential offsite uses that were legal until the legislature passed House Bill 546. Can you remind us of those uses that were technically legal prior to our passage of this act?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, Representative Small. Our agency had the ability to approve uses in the energy production industry, industrial uses, and road construction and maintenance.
Thank you. And I think it was also the generation of electricity, and the industrial piece could have, of course, been very widely interpreted. Secondly, Mr. Brankard, it's my understanding that the rulemaking, as you've stated in the presentation, in your rulemaking, according with the statute, you all are eliminating those potential uses that you all can no longer permit with that rulemaking. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Representative Small, that's correct.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Brankard. And I think appreciate your comment previously, just a little bit ago, that there was a whole lot of gray area. Now there is less. We should always be looking to improve things, but I think we can take a great deal of solace in many of the improvements that this important legislation was able to make. Secondly, I want to ask briefly Director Roos. Director Roos, you have really led an incredibly wide-ranging across the state, of course, pre-COVID public engagement process. Do you see that public engagement process continuing from these early stages all the way continuing on?
Mr. Chair, Representative Small, for the most part, yes. Certainly, we are making adjustments to our approaches to public engagement right now to protect public health from COVID-19. But as we think about, from my presentation, the phase one rulemaking, at any point in time that we have pen to paper and before we do any petition, send any petition to the commission, we'll engage in a public outreach campaign again on those draft rules to get public input before we even put something before the commission. So that's one point where we've mapped it out. We're actually in the process of working on updating our public involvement plan. There's currently one posted on our website from last year. We'll have an updated one this fall where we're contemplating other ways where we can keep the engagement going. I'll also note that there have been recent conversations within the Produced Water Research Consortium about increasing public engagement and opportunities for the public to understand what the consortium is doing. So I think we'll see some more public outreach from the Produced Water Research Consortium managed by NMSU in the coming year as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Director Roos. And I really just want to compliment that robust engagement, the commitment to engage before, really prior to the actual official beginning of any rulemakings. The standard that you, the Environment Department, and the Oil Conservation Division through Energy and Minerals are setting is a standard that I am tremendously grateful for. Constituents, many of whom folks who feel different ways about some of the pieces of this legislation, uniformly there is gratitude for the robust public engagement. It's a model for how we should tackle these challenging issues. Secondly, just briefly, both with Ms. Roos and also with Mr. Brankard, there is the disclosure for the volumes and sources of water used in oil field operations. As I understand it, the sources, that is fresh, potable, or recycled, treated, those are under a rulemaking now to be required, as Mr. Brankard said. Do you all see future and continued opportunities to expand that area of disclosure, working with all stakeholders?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative Small, I believe Director Roos can talk about what the Environment Department is doing. I think they are considering that, in fact.
Great.
And we're hoping that the data we get from this, rule requirement may generate other either rule requirements or other needs for data. So, yes.
Great. Thank you. And I know I want to be very respectful of time. I think that area of disclosure is one where there's broad agreement, and to see even in the midst of COVID-19, even with the budget cuts and crisis that were mentioned, that there is continued push forward on disclosure speaks, I think, incredibly well to the agencies and the professionals who are leading this effort. Briefly, I'd like to ask Ms. Bradfute, as we seek to diversify and look for different economic opportunities, it's my understanding, of course, we've all discussed the high TDS content, the very, very salty nature. There are regions of the world, there's research going on in the United States about something that is a clear waste product, this enormous amount of salt, how to look at economically useful applications, and specifically in things that like lithium and others that are actually critical to renewable energy generation use in electric cars and what have you. Are those some of the economic opportunities as we go further down this road that you see opening up for New Mexico?
Mr. Chair, Representative Small, absolutely. Over the past year, Marathon has engaged with a number of different companies who are interested in different uses of side products, byproducts created from produced water. Some of them have built models around selling salt. Actually, once the water's removed and the salt is dried and it's processed. Other companies want to focus on lithium and rare minerals that could be extracted from the produced water. So there are opportunities. It's going to be a question of when do those opportunities become economic. And so there's also going to be further policy opportunities to help companies think about investing within the state.
Thank you very much. I think that's so important as we face these incredibly challenging times, the need to innovate and to get folks back to work and to be a part of expanding energy opportunities, especially in those renewable energy areas. I guess my final question, and this would be for all of the panelists, it's really a broad question, knowing that we have set up the Produced Water Consortium, knowing that steering committee members whom are entrusted with direction of that consortium range across the ideological spectrum and have different views, as we've seen reported, which is as it should be. And there's been a repeated, and I fully agree, call to do deep, robust science and to continue doing that science for all of the reasons that we've all discussed. What do you all see as really necessary to support that scientific work so that we learn in the widest possible way, always focused primarily on public health and environmental safety with an eye towards economic opportunity? How do we ensure that the Produced Water Consortium and other efforts have what they need to go down this route of robust science and informed decision making? And that's for everyone. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of the panelists deeply.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Small. I've been actively involved with the consortium from day one, and I currently serve as the chair of the Government Advisory Board, which provides advice to the program director and the technical steering committee. It's a great question. I think we'll know more. I would be better equipped to answer that question a few months from now as we round out the first year of work that's going to inform the research plan. Once we know what the research plan looks like, we'll have a better sense of being able to assess what resources are needed and what the shortages are based on the investments that have been made in the consortium to date. I do think that there will need to be some additional investment from hopefully a variety of parties and sectors who are interested and invested in seeing a successful public health research outcomes. So that's as much as I can say today.
Thank you, Director.
Thank you, Representative Small. I think as a starting point, I think that it's important that the purpose of the Produced Water Consortium be directed towards a true independent scientific evaluation, and not towards and not a true scientific independent evaluation.
Keep losing your audio.
I apologize.
You're fading in and out. But go ahead, please.
Yeah. So I believe that the consortium at this point, its makeup and its funding source does not provide comfort to the public that it's an independent scientific body that's pursuing as its primary objective protection of public health and the environment. It seems to be geared towards and funded by industry, and the idea is to optimize profitability of this waste stream. And so that entire direction seems to be the wrong direction for the state. The idea that we can frack our way to a renewable energy future is an oxymoron. This is a waste stream. And if there are ways to safely use it within the oil and gas industry, we fully support that. We're very concerned about the industry-led push to move this waste stream outside the oil fields.
Mr. Chair, if I might respond and clarify one thing on that. While I appreciate Mr. Timmons' understanding and perspective, I would characterize the driver for the consortium not as industry in any way, but as the Environment Department driving scientific research so that we ultimately can make informed decisions, science-based decisions. And there are safeguards put in place that the Environment Department would not get behind the consortium or any outcomes of the consortium unless safeguards were in place to ensure that there's no undue influence by any particular participants in the consortium. That's essential. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Director. And Mr. Chair, I want to be respectful of time. So I'll conclude. I actually had very much meant to say one thing, and that is this, which is an incredibly heartfelt thank you to our incredible State of New Mexico staff, whether at the Oil Conservation Division, the New Mexico Environment Department, or the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources, and in other areas. They have been entrusted with a great deal. They have actually seen resources that have been shrunk even as their responsibilities have grown. And added to that, in some part, perhaps significantly, with House Bill 546 and their unprecedented public engagement process. Employees of the state doing their level best have been at times subjected to some incredibly, I think, unfair and personalized things that don't belong in that forum. And I just want to say thank you. It's part of what public service is about, and especially on the elected side, regardless of our party, that is something that we knowingly sign up for folks whose scientific careers and dedication to our state have led them into positions of responsibility within agencies. Even though that may be a part of this day and age, I don't think it is fair that they did not sign up for that. Nonetheless, it's part of things. I am deeply appreciative of the continued commitment to excellence, starting with public health and our environment. And I think that's worth saying, and I appreciate the indulgence. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Small. Next up, Representative Roybal Caballero. I think this is a really important and controversial topic. And I want to provide, everyone, including myself, the opportunity to ask questions. If we could keep the questions as brief as possible, the answers as direct as possible, I would appreciate it. Representative Roybal Caballero.
Mr. Chair, and pardon me for taking off the video. My family needs to move around me a little bit right now. So that's why it's off. Anyway, I do have a question. My question is directed to Ms. Bradfield. As we know, and we've been seeing much more, fracking has been expanding, and significantly so. And with that expansion, we've seen a significant increase in the amount of water that's being used. So, Ms. Bradfield, in this earlier presentation on methane that we heard, Marathon clarified that industry cannot stop using fresh water for fracking, and it requires fresh water for parts of industry operation. I'm wondering if you are able to answer whether if industry can quantify how much fresh water will be unavoidable on a per well or per pad basis.
Mr. Chair, if I could, I would like to defer to my colleague, Carrie Harpole, to help answer this more technical-based question.
Mr. Chair, thank you.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Yeah, so my clarification was not that fresh water can't be avoided in fracking. My clarification is typically fresh water is used in the drilling operations, which is a substantially smaller proportion. The exact amount I can't give you, but drilling is typically less than 10% of the water that's used through the whole process of both drilling and completing a well. In both drilling through the freshwater zones and cementing of the casing. So those are the areas where the freshwater is more critical. There will be small applications in operations, hydro testing, pipelines, those kind of things, but it's really small in the grand scheme of things for fracking. That's where you've seen over the last 10 years a very substantial migration from what was predominantly freshwater use in the 2010 to 2012 time period, where it's gone to a much more focused use of brackish water and recycled. And that is to get away from the freshwater resources. So I apologize if my previous statement made it seem as though it was necessary in completions. It's really not. The need in completions that may be driven by logistics can be if there is no brackish water or a volume of produced water available, then it could be needed for that. But that's more of a logistics issue rather than a technical issue.
So, Mr. Chair and Representative, just to clarify, freshwater is used in the drilling process, which is a separate process from the fracking part. That's the completion process. Very little freshwater would be needed in the completion process. So industry views those processes as two separate technical processes.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both. It led to a further, just one more clarifying question. Is there a way right now that you can measure the use of the water, whether it's used in either process? Do you measure it at all? Is there a way, an instrument used in the process, either drilling in, drilling out on the pad, or somewhere on the well that would indicate the use of water, the amount of water, and what that would quantify out as?
Yes, Representative. Almost always that water is metered, typically also because we pay people for it generally. So a lot of the water that may be used in the drilling process, especially if it's fresh, it either may be hauled in or it may be used with a smaller line, but there's a meter that's placed on those lines. And you have probably seen the large temporary lines that are put down for fracturing operations, and there are meters that are typically placed on those as well. Industry, through a lot of initiatives many years ago, those volumes are typically reported through Frac Focus. There has been a gap in Frac Focus for years where it was very difficult to record the quality of the water you were using. So unfortunately, many people thought that was all fresh. It really wasn't. There is a new initiative going on through the Groundwater Protection Council, which operates Frac Focus, to get some more segmentation on the quality of the water and the source of the water that's being used for those completions operations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you. It seems a natural process that there would be a way to quantify this, and it's important for us to evaluate that and to have that information and data, because as you all know, and as we all know, fresh water, period, and water access and conservation is particularly critical, especially during these extreme times and effects of climate change that we're experiencing. So you will see that there needs to be an answer to that question as we go along on all those processes. So however way we ensure that to happen, that would be really important. That was my only question, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the panelists. It was extremely helpful information, but it also leads to what more we need to know in all of these processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Rogal Caballero. Next up, we have Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will be brief because I know you also want to ask questions. Thank you for your patience. All right, I have a question and probably more for Jennifer Bradford. Thank you, Jennifer. It's been stated that approximately 86% of our chemicals in produced water have never been truly analyzed or studied. And that seems like pretty serious stuff. If there's any potential for any harm to our environment, land, people, water, whatever, it seems pretty serious. What's your perspective on that, Jennifer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator. I appreciate that question, and I'm going to answer part of it, and if I could, I would have Ms. Harpole fill in the other part because she actually knows the studies very well. But there have been a significant amount of studies done on the constituents in water. That's not to say that more studies aren't needed regarding water characterization, and that's why I fully support the work that the Produced Water Consortium is doing, and I fully support the position in the Produced Water Act that good science is needed before regulations can be issued. And that was something that was talked about during the 2019 legislative session a lot when groups were discussing the act, was we want good science and industry wants good science. Because we want to make sure we're on the hook liability-wise under the Act if something goes wrong. We talked about the liability provision under Section 4, subsection B. So industry is equally incentivized to make sure that this water is fully characterized and we know what's in it before it's used in out-of-oil field uses. I'm going to let Carrie Harpole talk about some of the existing studies if I can for just a second.
Thank you, Jennifer. On that, I think that sometimes there is a little bit of a misconception that the chemicals that are used in fracking or drilling don't have any, have not had any toxicology work done on them. They actually have. Most of them are classified. They have to be classified and labeled when they come out onto our site. I think so it is known what those are, whether it is a proprietary chemical that a fracturing company may be providing to us, or if it is just a known chemical that is a commodity like hydrochloric acid, for example. We know what the dangers of those are, its requirements through OSHA. I think what many people are talking about is the exposure levels and long-term toxicity issues potentially for things that may get on food, etc. And that is a different category. So the studies that are out there, one of the things that is also, I think, important for people to know is that there are things that are added to it in the fracturing process, but that percentage is actually very, very small. Some of the products that come up are either products that occurred naturally in groundwater, or they can also be reactions of various organics with things that are downhole under pressure and high temperature. So I do think it is important to know what is in there, but a lot of the toxicity work for generalized organics, it may not be a very specific component because organics go in wide swaths of categories. But the toxicity is generally similar for different classifications. So, but the water can be different in different areas. So it is important to understand what's in there. It's also important to understand how it can be removed and what the potential application of it is, which is some of the study that the Produced Water Consortium is doing, and also a Department of Energy study is looking at, to make sure that those nuances are applied before people get ahead of themselves.
Thank you for that. I noticed you did mention long-term toxicity issues, and you also mentioned that it could also be organic. That tells me about the situation being even more grave than what we're talking about, because it could be, but it may not be organic. And I think that this is very worrisome to me because, if we're depending on the federal government to do the studies, you're analyzing something, we're just not doing our job here at the state level. I truly believe we need to do more to ensure that, in fact, 100% of this produced water is analyzed to make sure that we see what effects it's going to have on our environment. And And I'll leave that, Mr. Chairman, because I know you want to ask questions than others, but I want to thank you for your presentations. Thank you, Jennifer, and others. I know that Wildlife Guardians, Daniel, has a different perspective, and his information was quite different from yours as far as the amount of water that is analyzed for additional chemicals or harmful chemicals. So anyway, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair, Senator, I will note that I'm going to turn my video off just because I understand hopefully that will help with the sound. I will point you to the one pager that we have attached in your packet that includes the citation to the recent report in the Environment International Journal, where that 86% neighbor came from. I will also note that just because something is natural does not mean it's safe. Radioactivity is a naturally occurring substance, but it is concentrated in the fracking and process. And so that is natural radioactive materials, but it is not treatable under traditional treatment technologies. And treatment effectively concentrates radiation, so even if you can clean up the produced water, you're left with a toxic, highly concentrated radioactive waste. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you for that explanation. Thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Next up, Senator Lopez. Senator Lopez, you're muted.
How about that?
That's much better. Thank you. So the audio is not great, but we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Mr.
Yeah, and now we lost
Can
you.
you hear me?
Off and on.
Let me turn off the camera.
Okay.
Are you there? Are you there?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I won't do the camera. Just a question, Mr. Chairman. With regards to, I know that I had read an article that was mentioning that there was some treated water coming into the state. And there were some questions as to, where is it coming from, et cetera, et cetera. And it was in the Albuquerque Journal about a week ago. So I was curious if there's anything in the rules being proposed or such that deals with imported water. Is there anything that we do just to see what's being brought into the state also? And this, of course, was in the Albuquerque Journal. Curiosity. Thank you.
Mr. Chair and Senator, if I may just address it kind of from a legal angle first, and others may have a viewpoint, but produced water isn't defined as being produced in New Mexico from oil and gas operation. It's more broadly defined as produced water that produced during operation, the gas operation. So I think that would cover all the regulations would apply regardless of the state the water was produced in.
And Mr. Chairman, Senator Lopez, the Environment Department and our agency has a notice of intent from a company that is trying to build a pipeline to bring in municipal solid waste water, and we're currently reviewing that to determine which agencies will have jurisdiction over regulating.
Okay, I'm just curious as to what it is and who can do so, and what do we do, to have some type of purview oversight on it. Just a little bit of concern on that one. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lopez. Representative Keel.
Mr. Chair, I know we are running over time, but I have some burning questions, so thank you for allowing me to ask this. I think my comment or question is directed to both Mr. Timmons as well as Director Roos. From my understanding, the produced water that we get comes out along with the oil. And if the produced water is showing radioactivity, then shouldn't there be a corresponding level of radioactivity in the oil itself? Can you explain that? I'm having some trouble understanding that.
That's a fantastic question. Thank you, Representative. Oil is absolutely radioactive, and it's been known by the industry for decades. From a 1982 report that was prepared for the American Petroleum Institute, their Department of Medicine and Biology. I will quote, "Almost all materials of interest and use to the petroleum industry contain measurable quantities of radionuclides that reside finally in process equipment, product streams, or waste. In addition, groundwater used for water flood and brine solutions from operating wells contain biologically significant quantities of radium-226 and radon-222. And so there's a fantastic report that was expose really recently in Rolling Stone magazine entitled America's Radioactive Secret, which I would encourage everyone to read because it provides a clear depiction of the unknown radioactive risks that are in particular are exposing oil and gas workers all around the country, all around the world, but including here in New Mexico. Again, all oil and gas workers are radiation workers. They just don't know it.
So, Mr. Chair and Mr. Timmons, thank you for that explanation and enlightening me on that subject. But does that mean that I, as a user of petroleum almost every day, should have been exposed to some level of radiation, which means by now I should have shown some evidence of radiation sickness? How do you explain that?
Mr. Chair and Representative, this is Carrie Harpole again with Marathon. I'd just like to clarify a little bit. So the ground itself contains radiation. There's radiation in a lot of things that are everyday things.
There's background radiation. Absolutely, I accept that.
Yeah, when you fly in airplanes, when you eat bananas, for example. So generally, the radioactive elements in the oil field, typically, they're not necessarily the same in all of the plays. The Marcellus, which is the one that is being referred to, is known to have a higher level of radiation, and frequently the natural occurring radiation comes out as a solid or as a scale. So it's typically radium that travels with barium, and that comes from the ground. Groundwater can also have that. Radon, if you go and look in for clean water, there is specifications regarding both radium and radon in groundwater wells. So it's one of the things that industry is also quite careful about. It typically comes out as solids, and that's why normally when disposing of our solid waste, that is checked for and then it is routed. So the amount that would be left in oil or produced water on its own, not counting if there's a sludge potentially in the bottom of the truck that doesn't get cleaned out, would be minimal.
So, Mr. Chair and Ms. Harpole, thank you for that answer. I worked in the coal industry because I was with the Public Service of New Mexico, and even the bottom ash that comes out of the boilers does have a certain level of radiation in it. And my question is this sufficiently low that we don't need to raise a red flag, or is this different from that level of background radiation that we do need to raise a red flag? That's what I'm driving at is this significant, or is this, I mean, if I fly an airplane, as you said, even my banana has radiation in it, but I live with it, and so far it hasn't had any consequences on my health. But the question here is this produced water radiation any more than that? And also the other related question I have for Director Roos is, yes, we monitor the tailings from the ponds that were left behind as a result of uranium mining. Why can't we transpose those regulations to apply to produced water? Those are my questions.
Mr. Chair, Representative Keel, thank you for that last question. I think it's a good example of a broader point that as we at the Environment Department look to move forward under the Produced Water Act and looking at new regulatory provisions around specifically oil and gas produced water being used outside of oil and gas, with under future rulemaking, we will absolutely be looking at our existing programs around regulation of all different types of contaminated wastes and water and things across the state. So we will look to existing models for where it makes sense to do so, and combine that regulatory analysis and approach with the science that's going to come out of the consortium to help us understand what's the right combination of regulatory principles. And I do expect that some of the ways in which we regulate other wastes, like your example of mining wastes, are going to be informative for us once we get into our phase 2 process.
Chair, Director,
Representative Keel.
I'm sorry, did somebody else say something?
This is Mr. Brancard. I would just say that following on Ms. Carpo's response, our agency does have regulations for naturally occurring radioactive material, NORM, that apply generally to the solid wastes associated with those regulations. So we do have regulations related to the standards for naturally occurring radioactive materials, but it applies mostly to the solid waste.
Okay, that is good. One last question, just a comparative analysis. Is our radioactive levels relative to the Marcellus waste? How do they compare? Be lower or higher? Can anybody give me an answer to that in a quantified way?
Representative Akil, I can't give you a definitive quantification. My understanding, as I believe was said earlier by one of the Marathon representatives, radium and radon are particularly high in the Marcellus. However, here in the Permian Basin specifically, the EPA has identified significant levels of uranium. So it's not a direct one-to-one comparison. It's a different type of radioactive material. But it has been well documented that the Permian Basin has high levels, significant levels of uranium.
Okay. All right, let me process that. And I don't want to take up committee time. I'll get back to Mr. Timmons, to you or to Director Roos, because now you're getting into some nuclear physics that I'm somewhat tentatively familiar with. So thank you so much for your answer. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me the time.
Thank you, Representative. I have a number of questions. We're way over time, so I'm going to hold my questions. I'd like to thank the panel. This is obviously an important topic, and I don't think we're at the place where the public or the legislature is comfortable with it. So thank you, everyone. We are going to move on, and for the upcoming panels, I would just like to say I apologize for running late. Our next panel, which was supposed to start 45 minutes ago and is supposed to end in 15 minutes, so if we keep it short, that would help us get a little bit back on schedule. Next panel is Oil and Gas Reform Act, and first up we have Eric Schlenker-Goodrich. Mr. Schlenker-Goodrich, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, good afternoon. I hope you're all well. I'm grateful for the opportunity to present today to discuss the prospect of reforming the Oil and Gas Act. My name is Eric Schlenker-Goodrich. I'm the Executive Director of the Western Environmental Law Center based here in Taos. WELC is a nonprofit public interest law firm that uses the power of the law to safeguard the public lands, wildlife, and communities in the American West in the face of a changing climate. For today, I provided you with a handout that outlines a set of recommendations to reform the Oil and Gas Act. It's up on the screen now. I hope these recommendations spark a constructive conversation to reform the Oil and Gas Act to better safeguard the public interest. Before I delve into the details, I'd like to make two overarching points. First, all of my recommendations are premised on a basic imperative that the Oil and Gas Act should be modernized to account for the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. Climate change is animating and now accelerating a global transition away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy. We can argue about the precise speed of that transition, but it's difficult to argue against its reality. And we have an opportunity here in New Mexico to account for that global context. Second, I want to acknowledge the challenge that our state's dependence on oil and gas revenue creates. My family, including my two young children, live here, and I am acutely aware of the budget challenges we face as a state. So in addition to the recommendations I'm providing today, I hope we can work together to diversify our state's revenue streams, transition to a sustainable economy rooted in clean energy, and provide new economic opportunities to communities that now rely heavily on oil and gas development, all with an eye towards best positioning New Mexico for the future. I see immense opportunity in that shared work, and it's that opportunity that shapes my recommendations here today. Now, in terms of technical recommendations, my handout contains 2 concise pages as well as exhibits providing the key existing statutory provisions I refer to. On page 1, which is up on the screen at number 1, I recommend reform of the Oil and Gas Act to include an overarching, explicit, and clear mandate to safeguard the public interest. In other words, to protect and minimize impacts to the climate, public health, environmental justice, and land, water, and wildlife. Right now, that mandate does not exist. Now, there are some references in the Oil and Gas Act to, for example, protection of fresh water resources. We discussed those a little bit a few minutes ago in terms of produced water. But those provisions are in very specific, compartmentalized subsections of the Oil and Gas Act. There is no overarching mandate. To help illustrate this, I'd like to refer you to Exhibit 1 of my handout, which starts on page 3 of the PDF. And if we could go to page 3 of the PDF. Exhibit 1 is a copy of Section 70-2-12 of the Oil and Gas Act. It's this section which outlines the Oil Conservation Division's core powers. And specifically, I'd like you to compare Section B7, which is on page 4, with Section B15, which is on page 5. Section B7 on page 4 provides the Oil Conservation Division with authority over drilling permits, but it does not contain a mandate to protect the public interest. Conversely, subsection 15 regarding produced water does. In other words, the Oil Conservation Division's authority to protect the broader public interest is absent from key Oil Conservation Division responsibilities, such as drilling permits, but is existent in other sections. But overall, it's far too compartmentalized. There's no overarching mandate. This is important because the absence of an overarching public interest mandate can contribute to conflicts involving oil and gas. Conversely, by providing that overarching mandate, we could do a much better job of avoiding conflicts, improve the credibility of decisions, and set the stage for a more constructive statewide conversation regarding oil and gas. Now, if we could go back to page 1 of my handout, I also recommend, in number 2, expanding the composition of the Oil Conservation Commission. People want and deserve to have a voice in the decisions that affect their lives. But right now, the Oil Conservation Commission has only 3 members, 2 from within the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, and 1 from the State Land Office. Expanding the commission with a broad expanse of public voices, such as from the education or public health sector, from tribes, or from the environmental community, lets the public see itself reflected in the commission. Excuse me. As with the inclusion of a public interest mandate, diversification of the commission will go far in improving the strength and credibility of its decisions. On page 2 of my handout, if we could forward to that, in number 3, I recommend that the Oil and Gas Act be amended to improve opportunities for public involvement, agency transparency, and industry accountability. Effectively, this would help implement my recommendation of a new public interest mandate and address a key problem I've identified, the marginal role now provided to the public to help shape oil and gas decisions, which is caused by a variety of factors, which I note in paragraph 3A. Today, I'd like to touch on a couple of recommendations, which I outline in 3B. Specifically, in Roman numeral I recommend that the Oil and Gas Act be amended to provide opportunities for public involvement with an eye towards avoiding conflicts before they arise. For example, through establishing setbacks that protect the public interest. Right now, oil and gas development decisions are driven almost entirely by investment decisions made by oil and gas companies, not the broader public interest. In Roman numeral II, I recommend lifting the administrative penalties cap of $200,000 set by Section 70-2-31D of the Oil and Gas Act, which I've attached as Exhibit 5. Including a cap is unfair to companies that work hard to stay in compliance and rewards the worst industry actors, and it just doesn't protect the public interest. In Roman numeral III, I recommend that the Oil and Gas Act allow the Oil Conservation Division use credible evidence obtained from third parties in enforcement actions as evidence of noncompliance. If the public obtains credible evidence that an oil and gas operator is not in compliance with laws, rules, or a permit, the Oil Conservation Division should be allowed and duty bound to use that information to enforce those requirements. In Roman numeral 4, I expand on the theme of the public's role in enforcement. When a company breaks a law, rule, or permit requirement, the Oil and Gas Act should empower the public to enforce those requirements in court when the Oil Conservation Division either doesn't or can't because of budgeting, or staffing constraints. Such authority would provide the public with increased confidence that they can protect their families when the government can't or won't. Lastly, in number 3C, I recommend we strengthen and align the authorities and duties of other state agencies who already play key roles in protecting the public interest. In particular, I recommend that we remove the no more stringent than limitation in section 74-2-5C of the Air Quality Act, which I've attached as Exhibit 7, and which prevents the Environment Department from promulgating public health and air quality safeguards that are stronger than those set by the Environmental Protection Agency. For example, with regard to hazardous air pollutants. I'm pleased that Senator Ortiz-Pino and Director Eli discussed this possibility earlier today on the methane panel. There's simply no good reason in my mind why New Mexico should handcuff itself to air quality decisions made by federal officials in Washington, D.C. or Dallas, Texas. Where appropriate, New Mexico can and should take stronger action than the federal government to protect New Mexico's air quality and public health. With that, I'll end my presentation and I'll turn it over now to Mario Atencio with Diné Care. Thank you.
Mr. Atencio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and honorable members of the committee. My name is Mario Atencio. I'm a member of Diné Care and also a stakeholder in federal Indian land parcels held in trust by the Department of Interior in Northwest New Mexico. Those land parcels are under jurisdiction of the Mexico OCC, Mexico OCD in regards to some of the topic, and even the Mexico Environmental Department, the topics I'm going to discuss today as they're loading here on the screen. Just have 2 pages here for you. One talks about the well density case with Hilcorp in New Mexico, and specifically with the supposed expansion of well density in the Blanco Mesa Verde gas pool. The changes there were granted by New Mexico OCD. All the hearings were taking place in Santa Fe, and then a lot of the federally owned landowners, Indian landowners, were based in Northwest New Mexico, hundreds of miles away. And so my comments here are always in support of Eric Seikinger Goodrich's idea for public interest. And so these well densities, which I presented before OCC, and gladly the decision was overturned. Just pointing out that the Blanco Mesa Verde gas pool up in the San Juan Basin is that whole area is now the watershed for nearly all of Eastern Navajo Nation and the over 40,000 individual Indian landowners within Northwest New Mexico. Those are estimated figures. And when these decisions were placed, when these decisions happened, there was no really outreach to any type of community level, no outreach at the community level that we've seen. Just some letters given directly to people, and a lot of people there are English language learners still. And so that there needs to be much more public input regards to changes such as the Blanco Mesa Verde gas pool well density increases that were approved by New Mexico OCD. So within that, that's what you're seeing here. And just to give more context to why it's very important, especially in those places off Navajo Nation, the area is intensely sacred homelands to the Navajo Nation. Literally, it's our national epic is there, and it's hard to really get that point across to people. Is that the setting is where our national heroes. It's something akin to Thor and Odin. That's the type of stories that are out in that landscape. So it's very, very important. Just one case in point, I guess one of the wells, there is a gas well. I think it might be an oil well right at the foot of one of our most sacred peaks It's called Gobernador Nab. There's an oil and gas well right at the bottom of it. So it's very important that those places and that these decisions being made in Northwest New Mexico are communicated to Navajo Nation. Next slide, please. And so that's with the well density. I'm going to talk next about setbacks. Again, operators will go to New Mexico Environmental Department or New Mexico OCD and ask for release of setbacks from occupied home structures. And we're seeing that I think now that the current regulation, federal regulations at 660 feet from occupied home structures, and they go to OCD and ask for up to 330 feet, and they get those exemptions. And so you're seeing here is a big a multi-stage or a fracked horizontal well facility, which is within 599 feet of occupied home structure, which I just put up there for the committee. And Tom, if you can't really see it, you can probably zoom in. That facility there is releasing, I'm putting here 67.8248 tons of volatile organic compounds a year. That's maybe one of hundreds of wells in the Counselor Navajo Nation chapter community. Just with maybe within 2 or 3 miles is something equivalent to 200 tons of volatile organic compounds being permitted by New Mexico Environmental Department and sometimes they're this close, and so they get exemptions from New Mexico OCD. All this done without no one talking with local leaders, local community leaders, even individual Indian landowners and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the trustees, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So state of Colorado has 1,000-foot setbacks from occupied homes. Again, all this done, all of the decision making done in Santa Fe with no real communication with local landowners. And so that's probably the two things I really wanted to highlight in terms again with supporting Eric's points of there needs to be more input. There needs to be a public interest component to the Mexico Oil and Gas Act. And so with that, I really want to thank you, Chairman, and honorable members of the committee for your time, and want to pass it on.
Okay, next up, I think we have James Jimenez. You're muted. There we go.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'd like to expand just a little bit on some of Eric's initial comments about the need for sustainability and diversification. September 1986 was when I first began trying to understand oil and natural gas's impacts on New Mexico. I'd just been hired by David Abbey, yes, that same David Abbey, as an economic analyst at DFA before he went to the LFC. And one of my main responsibilities was to help estimate state general fund revenues. In September 1986, West Texas Intermediate Sweet was which is oil, was trading at around $15 per barrel. But New Mexico production was trading at the West Texas Intermediate sour levels, which were even lower than that, by sometimes as much as $3 or $4 a barrel. Natural gas at Henry Hub, which was the primary trading hub at that point in time, we were trading for less than $2 per 1,000 cubic feet. Back in those days, it was easy to estimate oil production levels because New Mexico's oil fields were considered mature, and oil production was on a steady 2% decline and had been for many, many years. Among the biggest concerns were what to do about the large number of stripper wells, which are low production wells, which many producers threatened to shut in because of the low prices. Well, over the next 30 plus years, I've seen a number of boom and bust cycles in the industry and the subsequent and the state general fund, both good and bad. Clearly, the industry has been very important in helping fund education and other services in our state, as well as providing thousands of jobs for New Mexicans. But the state general fund has also ridden these cycles up and over and over. During the Richardson years, we rode a price-driven bubble that poured millions of dollars in the state coffers. But of course, it eventually collapsed, contributing to deep cuts in education, healthcare, and other services that were sustained through the Martinez years. In fact, for a period of time, New Mexico led the nation or was near the top in cuts to higher education in our public schools. And we've seen the consequences of those cuts, which is also our state policymakers, like our legislators and governor, have virtually no control over. Despite our inability to control these forces, however, we've continued to deepen our reliance on these highly volatile oil and gas revenues through ill-considered tax policy decisions. During boom times, we slashed taxes for the biggest corporations and the most wealthy individuals, cutting the revenue we receive from other parts of our tax code, making us more and more reliant on oil and gas revenues. Not only has our reliance on these revenues grown, but we've made the tax system even more unfair, as now those making the most pay about half the rate in state and local taxes than those earning the least pay. Key among the decisions that have worsened the tax equity of our system have been the large PIT cuts and the large, which are personal income taxes, and the large corporate income tax cuts. In both cases, we were promised the cuts would spur job growth, but there's been no evidence to show that these cuts provided the promised jobs. But what has been demonstrated is that we now have an unsustainable reliance on oil and gas revenues to support the most basic investments to move our state forward. As we look to the future, there are several things that we at New Mexico Voices would recommend. First, diversify our revenue streams and reduce our reliance on oil and gas by better balancing state general fund sources through the personal income tax and the corporate income tax code. Second, find a way to reduce the gross receipts tax. As many of you legislators know, it ranges close to 10% in some communities. We need to do this, though, in a way that still allows municipalities to fund the services their residents need that the state does not provide. Next, invest in family sustainability by expanding the Working Families Tax Credit and the Low-Income Comprehensive Tax Rebate, both of which make the system fair and helps families support themselves. These programs are also an important part of pandemic and economic recovery because they'll help the New Mexicans that are struggling. And we believe it's really the best way to spur an economic recovery, which is to get money into the hands of people who will spend it quickly and locally. In a massive way, we also need to invest in economic sustainability through economy expanding infrastructure like roads, bridges, water, sewer, and drainage systems. These are the fundamentals that government can and should help provide to help our private economy be successful. These systems are important for urban economies, but maybe even more so for tourist, art, or especially farming and ranching economies. Getting products to market efficiently is good for everyone. Continue to invest in healthcare in a big way. During the Great Recession, it was about the only sector that grew. Yet during the pandemic, we've seen that our healthcare system is still inadequate for far too many New Mexicans. Most especially, invest in technological sustainability through broadband and other technologies, which I'm really pleased to see is getting renewed attention from many of you legislators. And finally, invest in knowledge sustainability through education and other supports that help boost the entrepreneurial economy that can grow and reduce our reliance on single industries. Now, I've been around long enough to know that these changes will not result in an overnight miracle. And too often, politicians have not had the patience to maintain the support for areas of our economy that are either in transition or just being created. But at the end of the day, it is vitally important that we continue to invest in sustainability, both economic and financial. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate the time you've given me today.
Thank you, Mr. Jimenez. We have one more speaker on this panel, Nick King. Are you with us?
Yes.
Please proceed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, legislators, staff, NGOs, and the industry for all your hard work on this. This has really been an interesting, informative, and important time, especially in light of the great responsibility that we all carry for not only the future of New Mexico, but also for the whole planet. Since we here in the Permian Basin are one of the largest methane emitters, which causes global warming for the whole world and all the ramifications of that. My name is Nick King, and I'm a pastor at the Carlsbad Mennonite Church and a member of Citizens Caring for the Future, which seeks to find a safe path to ensure protections for our community in the face of health and environmental dangers posed by the oil and gas development in southeast New Mexico. Now, the lifeblood of the Permian Basin and New Mexico, as we all know, is oil. But our lifeblood is poison to the rest of the planet. Flaring, the venting, the leaking of methane, and the use of fossil fuel. But the good news is that the future is moving away from fossil fuels, moving toward a cheaper, cleaner energy economy that protects people on our planet. So oil and gas are on hospice, and we need to start phasing it out responsibly by addressing, number one, what is the greatest good for everybody? We, or you as government, need to look at the bigger picture first and protect the public interest. And if you don't protect the people of New Mexico and the world, who will? Second, we need laws that have impacts. The laws without enforcements are pointless. Right now, we have two environmental cops, so to speak, to protect all of Eddy and Lee County and the 40,000 whales that are here, and they live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Come on, how are they going to do that? They continue to issue permits, just like blank checks, with little accountability. All the other industries in the state, nursing homes, solar, electrical, are highly regulated and enforced. But oil, most dangerous of all. Third, it seems there is no power or recourse for the community. This year, when there was a produced water line that broke and sprayed several homes, who does one call? Or if flares are not lit, no one seems to respond to complaints. If perhaps an agency person would come to investigate, they have no equipment, even FLIR cameras to document it, and very little authority to do anything. And they are obviously completely understaffed. There seems to be no overarching coordinating body for the different agencies. 4, who will clean up after this dying industry once the oil companies leave? Legislated bonding going forward certainly needs to be more realistic, and we will be holding the bag if they don't. 5, we need adequate funding for these agencies to protect all of us. This has been pointed out how understaffed and underfunded these agencies are that have done excellent work. 6, we need basic common sense laws and enforcement that protect the public, including by giving the public the power to hold oil producers to their promises, and gives the public some say in when, where, and how development can happen. With self-reporting and too little enforcement, we can all see very basic mechanical problems that are not fixed just to save a dime. Without laws, the whole industry devolves into a race to the bottom. That then becomes a crime against humanity, against nature, against God. We depend upon the government to do the right thing for the most people. May God have mercy upon our selfishness and short-sightedness. May God give each of you legislators the strength to do the right thing to make sure the people are protected and to help move us into a clean energy future for the good of all of us people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. King. We're going to go to questions from the members, and I remind you to raise your hand virtually. First on the list, we have Senator Rodriguez, although she might not have put her hand down from the last panel. Senator, are you with us? Senator Nancy Rodriguez? Okay, so we're going to move on to Senator Antoinette Sedillo Lopez, who I think left us and came back. Senator. Or perhaps not.
I'm sorry, can I pass? Please, can I come back? I need to pass right now. Thank you.
Okay, Senator. Any other questions from members of Senator Cervantes? Co-chair or Vice Chair Cervantes.
Hello, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee and panelists. Fascinating conversation. We should probably have 3 days on the topics that have been presented and raised. My question really is for Mr. Jimenez. We should probably spend hours together talking about this. James would like to do so. I've been in the legislature 20 years. I've worked with 4 administrations and lots of colleagues. Every one of them has the same message you had today, which is we have to improve our private economy in New Mexico and reduce our dependence on oil and natural gas. This is not to sound critical at all, but you had a number of years during the Richardson administration. I want the benefit of that experience. Why do we keep talking about this for 20 years and we never seem to really make very much progress with it? What are we not doing? What should we be doing, in your opinion? Again, I'm relying on your, I think, a very highly placed position that you had for a number of years to have essentially been at the governor's right hand for all those years. I agree with your message. I agree with your goals and objectives. Why does it never happen?
Mr. Chairman and Senator, I think that there's a number of reasons that we can point to. One of them, I think, has to do with the places that political power resides. And one of the more interesting things I think I've seen occurring just in the last few years has been sort of a change in the political dynamics in the state, where power is being exerted to influence who gets elected, frankly, and the kinds of policies that are being passed in ways I think that oftentimes didn't happen in the past. So I would say that that would be a piece of it. Another piece of it would be that some of these changes we're talking about require sustained commitment on the part of a legislature and a sustained commitment on the part of a governor. And Senator Cervantes, as you well know, that frequently is not a long time span. Too often, the needs of a campaign or the needs of the political system sort of tend to drive these longer term decisions to the background, to the detriment of everyone, I think. I think that really to the detriment of legislators too, who would like to be able to do the right thing, but too often are not provided, political cover, for the lack of a better term, because they're constantly having to defend the most recent vote that they took. The last thing I would say is that one of the more important resources that the industry, oil and gas industry, has provided us over time is an immense amount of money to invest in our basic infrastructure. And frankly, it's been both the executive branch and I think the legislative branch also that have been culpable in not using those non-recurring dollars in the most effective way to really do one of the most important things that I believe government can do that I mentioned earlier, and that is provide the basic infrastructure that the private economy needs in order to be successful. And again, I'm talking about water and sewer and drainage and roads and bridges and broadband. I think that's absolutely a basic infrastructure need of our state. And if the executive and the legislature could get together on these long-term investments, I think that it's going to go a long way towards building that pathway to the future that this state needs.
Thank you,
Senator. Is something we could probably talk about for a very long time.
Yeah, I would, and I got to leave room for everyone else who's on this phone call, but I would like talking about it more. I just want to explore one thing you said, Mr. Jimenez, real quick. You said where the places where the power resides. Are you talking about geographies? Are you literally talking about the where in the state the power resides? And if so, what am I missing? Are we from down here? You know where I live. We seem to be in our own world down here in southern New Mexico. we're probably much more closely aligned with El Paso in Texas than Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And I got to tell you, for the folks that are not familiar with this part of the country, part of the state, this area is booming. You know, I mean, El Paso is exploding, booming economically. Las Cruces is doing pretty well, mostly the beneficiaries of that. But what did you mean when you say the places where power resides? What do you mean by that?
Well, no, it really has nothing to do with geography. And, you know, by the way, I have lived in southern New Mexico. In fact, I was born in Carlsbad, and my dad's family is from the village of Doñana, and I lived there myself. And southern New Mexico is very special to me for those reasons. But no, it really has nothing to do with geography. I think it really is more about the ability of a vast number of legislators that come from very different interests. Senator, you represent southern New Mexico and the Las Cruces area whose needs are frankly different than what my senator has. Some of them are aligned, certainly along education, and whether it's K-12 or early childhood education or higher ed are aligned. But really recognizing that it's through this collective action model that I think we can best move this state forward. And I think Mr. King, Reverend King, talked about some of the importance of ensuring that the voices of average New Mexicans are being heard. And I know all of you strive to do that on a daily basis. But I think more and more what we're seeing is through technology, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, that more and more people are able and willing to engage in the political dialogue, which I think is a fantastic thing, as frustrating and as annoying as it can be sometimes. I think it's a great way for more people to become involved. So, and using this kind of technology to allow more people to become involved, I think is also a very positive thing. So that's the kind of thing I mean when I'm talking about where power is coming from and where pressures are coming from.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And again, I want to make sure I leave lots of time for my colleagues and the chair to keep this meeting on track. I'd like for you to call me, James, when you have a chance, Mr. Jimenez, and talk more about it. I think I don't mean to exclude anyone else from the panel, but your role to me has always seemed a unique one, where frankly, I think the Richardson administration, probably more than others I've served with, seemed very focused on the success of the private sector. And frankly, some ways, looking back on it, you know, I didn't support those corporate tax cuts. And I never voted for any of those bills because I agree with you. I don't think they really are the way to move us into the private sector. But you were there. You know, you were in the governor's office every day, hour after hour, day after day. I think you have a unique role in realizing what leadership can ultimately do. I think that's what the answer to all of my questions that you gave me is leadership. It all comes down to leadership, and that's a good thing because that means we can solve the problems. They're in our grasp if we choose to embrace the challenge. So the only other point that I would add in closing is you talked about the use of non-reoccurring dollars for infrastructure. I think what you're saying in code for me, what I hear your words saying is we need capital outlay reform in a huge way. And of course, I've been with Representative McQueen and others for Senator Tallman, really been pushing and advocating for capital outlay reform in a meaningful way, and I agree with you there. We've got hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that are just not being put to good use. And my last comment is only that the one thing that has been interesting to me when we go through this economic challenge, the times we're in, what I didn't realize until recently is how many millionaires were created during the Great Depression. A lot of people made a great deal of money during the Great Depression, and I think we're going to look back on these years and see the same thing. We're seeing a lot of people being hurt, but I see a lot of money, even here in New Mexico, hundreds of millions of dollars that are moving through the state coffers. And they're going to the people that, in many cases, may not be those that are the greatest in need. And if you look at the PPP program or any of the other things that we've all worked with, I'll be straight. Our businesses took advantage of PPP. A lot of people that I know and do business with all took advantage of PPP. And other things that are being put out there. There's a lot of money moving into folks' hands who know how to access the system, and a lot of people maybe are not getting the benefit of a lot of that money. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. We do have a couple people on the list, but I don't think they're actually on the list because of the requirement of putting your hand back down once you're done. So with that, we're going to wrap this panel up. I do appreciate your input. I think it's some good things to think about and also some specific action items. But in the interest of time, since we're running late and I'm getting pinged by people on the next panel, let's move on. So thank you all. Thank you all the panelists. In our next panel, here it is, New Mexico Clean Energy Workforce Development Study. I have yesterday's agenda, which was updated, but I have two speakers, beginning with Dr. Gabriel Sanchez. Dr. Sanchez, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee. My voice coming through okay?
You sound great.
Excellent. Knowing time is of the essence, I think my slide deck is being pulled up. I greatly appreciate some time to provide a little bit of an overview of some work that we did recently for Workforce Solutions. And I have the secretary with me who will provide some commentary after I finish my slide deck. In short, our task was mainly to analyze the state's infrastructure in the context of job growth as we transition towards clean energy. But what I want to share with you are some of the high points of our findings, talking specifically to community members, really as it relates to the potential impact, both environmentally and in terms of economically, from this transition. Next slide, please. Real briefly, our team, if folks are not aware, I'm a professor of political science at the University of New Mexico and also oversee the Center for Social Policy, which has a number of different research institutes underneath that heading. We relied on all of our team for this particular project, including the Native American Budget and Policy Institute, which really ensured that this report included the voices of Native American communities across the state, which are often left out of these discussions, and their voice is often not included in terms of policy recommendations and thinking specifically about economic development. Our Cradle to Career Policy Institute, formerly known as CEPR, conducted higher education analysis across the entire state. I won't go into great detail about that today, but I will note that an upside is their analysis indicated that particularly our community college system has essentially the infrastructure needed to prepare the workforce of the future in clean energy. So we have that infrastructure already in place. And our Center for Civic Policy here in the state of New Mexico was a vital partner to us that made sure we were connected with community members across the state of New Mexico and the voices of all the population, including those that live in rural segments of the population, Spanish speakers, those who might not be citizens, etc., that all of those voices were included in the findings that I'll share with you today. Next slide, please. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about methodology, just want to hit on the high points. Folks can follow up with me if they wish for the specifics on our methods. But we did an extensive landscape analysis, really looking at the best practices both nationally and across other states for workforce preparation, as well as looking at the national trends in terms of diversity of clean energy workforce. One important finding there is that, consistent with what we heard from community members, that this energy workforce is not the most diverse in regard to race, ethnicity, gender, or other important demographic factors. That in fact holds true when you look at both the national and other benchmark state analyses. So I think as we think about transitioning towards clean energy, I think here in New Mexico, we want to do a better job of ensuring that the workforce reflects the demographics of the overall state's population. We also, as noted, did an extensive analysis of the higher education system, including a number of interviews with key personnel, not just faculty, but administrative leads and program leads that look at workforce preparation. And what I'll share mostly with you today are results from our online survey. Had just under 1,800 total participants, was done in both English and Spanish, and focus groups that had roughly 110 participants, and those again were done in English and Spanish. Our main goal with that aspect of the methodology was ensuring that we actually had community input on all of these important decisions and really got a sense of both their optimism and their fears as it relates to not just transition to workforce, but the transition towards clean energy more broadly. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll jump right into it. I'll note that I'm going to share just roughly 5 to 10 minutes of content with you today. I probably have 70 more slides that will be made available for folks that want to dig more into this, as well as the full report, both a long and a short version that can be made available on request for you to be able to dig more deeply into this. Next slide. I'll note that the context in which we fielded both the focus groups and the survey is important. This was right in the middle of the outbreak of COVID-19 and the initial indicators of the economic impact that the virus was having, not just on the state of New Mexico, but nationally. This slide indicates that there's high levels of concern, as you might imagine, not only about the overall state's economy as it relates to COVID, but specifically the negative impact that it had on the oil and gas industry. You see that roughly half of all respondents indicated that they were either very worried, somewhat worried, that the overall oil and gas industry was being hammered by COVID-19. Next slide, please. Although all respondents had some level of concern, what we do find in the survey is that it provides a window of opportunity for policymakers like yourselves to think about diversification of the state's economy. You see that 66% of all respondents indicated that this provides an opportunity to actually make radical changes and reform the state's economy, to not be as reliant on the oil and gas industry. Much less support you see, 38% indicating that the state should provide resources right now to help sustain the oil and gas industry, which is significantly less than, again, 66% of respondents who indicated that the state should diversify the economy because of the instability of oil and gas revenue. So I think the take-home message on these two slides, population is very aware and concerned about the implications of COVID-19 on the oil and gas industry, but sees this as a window of opportunity to make significant reforms to diversify our economy, really in line with the conversation that you folks just finished up with the last panel. Next slide, please. One of the biggest take-home messages of our overall study is that there's very limited knowledge of the Energy Transition Act and the positive upsides to jobs and clean energy that will come with that transition. Next slide, please. Just showing one indicator of many that we had in the survey, and also what we heard on the ground in the focus groups, is that although a sizable segment, roughly 45% of all respondents indicated that they've heard something about the Energy Transition Act, and when we followed up with folks, their knowledge was very, very limited. They did not have a sense of how quickly this was coming, and many of them did not understand the benefits that might be associated with this transition, both environmentally as well as economically, in terms of job growth and the transition towards new industries that might fuel new economic streams for the state of New Mexico. Next slide, please. As reflected in this quote, when we talked to a number of different stakeholders across the state of New Mexico, almost all indicated that either they themselves or their organizationship members or the constituents that they report to all indicated that for the most part, folks in the community might know a little bit about the Energy Transition Act, but beyond just what it is, they had very limited knowledge about the benefits, and particularly were relying on only catchphrases that they might see on the media and didn't have a really in-depth knowledge about what this means to them at the individual level, their family, or their community. Next slide, please. However, on an upside, after providing some pretty basic information about the Energy Transition Act, some of the findings from our landscape analysis, we found that in the survey, you saw significant increases in the perceived benefits of this transition, both in the context of economically and environmentally. Whether we frame that, as you see here, in terms of perceived benefits to them at the individual level or their family, or benefits to the state or the wider community, you see that after providing some relatively basic information, there were significant increases in their overall perception that this will actually benefit they themselves as well as the wider community. Next slide, please. I think of importance to this particular committee, when we framed what do you think would be the most important aspects of this transition today at the individual level or their family, although you see sizable segments reported having jobs available in these clean energy industry sectors, others indicated just overall economic development associated with the clean energy industry at a high level, as well as potentially some cost savings at the family level as the transition really makes some of this energy more efficient. you see that the number one or modal response was the environmental benefits of using clean energy at 68%. So even though our study was particularly framed at the economic side of this and job growth, we did see evidence across our survey and the focus groups that the population, once provided with some basic information, clearly sees the benefits environmentally. And I think that's one thing that I think the committee should really look forward to reading our report in more detail to understand how we might be able to expand the knowledge base of this important upside. Next slide, please. Because this was specifically focused on job growth and the economic side of the equation, I want to just note that consistently across our qualitative interviews, we heard that as folks got a little bit of information about what jobs might become available, and they heard things from our landscape analysis, such as we see a significant impact on wages, even at relatively low levels of educational attainment, basic level training in clean energy positions, that those folks make significantly more money per hour than folks with the same level of education that work in other industries. There was huge desire for more information, huge desire for training opportunities, and being able to think about transitioning towards those sectors. One of the take-home messages was, once folks started to hear a little bit more about these opportunities, they unfortunately had some concerns, particularly that these jobs would only be available to folks that live in the Albuquerque Metro or Santa Fe areas of the state, would be excluded to folks that live in rural areas. Fortunately, our landscape analysis suggested that that's exactly the opposite of reality, that in most cases, job growth would actually happen in rural segments of the state. And we saw positive traction towards that from community members once they learned about it. So again, take-home message was more information provided to the community will increase the optimism and excitement about this transition. Next slide, please. So with that, my final couple points really focus on, in our opinion, one of the big take-home messages of our study was that there needs to be significant outreach, maybe an outreach campaign specifically focused across the state on the benefits, both environmentally and economically, of this transition, and what at the individual and family level folks can do now to prepare for these jobs of the future. I'll close with, next slide, please, just a couple of examples that we put together in our report of relatively simple infographics that our team or others that do a better job of this than even us at the research level can do to really provide some of the upsides of the benefits. Next slide, please. Next slide, if you can. I'll just show you one of these as an example of just relatively simple and straightforward infographics that can be put together to make information accessible to the community, and if done in multiple languages and really used digitally, this can be done on a very cost-effective approach to basically ensure that the population understands what's coming ahead, what these jobs look like, and particularly what the environmental benefits, both at the family level and the state, look like as we think about the transition associated with the energy and transition. Thank you. You can go to the last slide. Just close me out with my contact information that you can utilize if you want to get the hard copy of our full report, if you want to see the full slide deck. If you contact me with any questions or request that information, I'll make sure to get it to you very quickly. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for the time to provide a really short but hopefully helpful overview of our larger analysis.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez. Our last panelist today is former State Representative Bill McCamley. Secretary McCamley, are you ready?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have a formal presentation. I was just here to provide support to Professor Sanchez and just let you know that our interactions with him have been extremely good. He has not only treated this whole study with a lot of professionalism and depth of knowledge, but he actually helped us do a worker survey, which we use almost every day for the unemployed folks that we've got in New Mexico, and help us figure out how to get information to them better and provide for them better. In terms of this presentation as a whole, the only thing I'll say is that we did start a registered apprenticeship program with Affordable Solar for that company, who's going to be doing a lot of the work to kind of implement some of the stuff in the Energy Transition Act, specifically with solar panel installation. And so we will take the study and use it where we can to try to really further the green, clean energy sector in the state. With that, Ms. Chair, I know we're really late anyway. I'd love to stand for any questions you might have in support of Professor Sanchez.
Okay. Thank you both. Bill, good to see you. Thanks for being here. Going to the members, I think Abbas has raised, Representative Keel has raised his hand. I think Senator Cedillo Lopez is a leftover. Representative Keel.
Oh, so I'm the only one left standing, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
At the moment.
A couple of quick questions for Dr. Sanchez. First of all, thank you for including the Native American voices in your survey. I'm going to be speaking at the Scientific Community College Distributed Energy Summit coming up pretty soon on workforce. That's, of course, related to the work you have done very heavily, but I was very surprised to find your findings about the limited knowledge that our fellow citizens have about the Energy Transition Act. And I'm very concerned about that because this is a key piece of legislation which is going to determine our future for our environment, for our children. And I'm very concerned by the fact that most of our citizenry does not recognize the importance of this act or the impact it could have on their lives. Your infographics are very good. And I really want to find out how we can, or who will be responsible for further educating our voters and fellow citizens about the ETA. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely.
What agency or what body do you think is most suitable to do that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, thank you very much for that question. I think one opportunity that has emerged from the participation of a number of different nonprofits across the state who helped connect us with their community members to field the study. All of those organizations have all hit on the same thing that you have, that they are concerned that very few of their members knew much about this, but we're also very optimistic of the fact that once they did hear a little bit of information about it, they wanted more. And we're excited about training opportunities to think about some of these emerging jobs. So I think in short, if we as a collective entity of researchers and policymakers think through what the content should look like for that outreach effort, I think these organizations would be more than willing to help circulate that information directly to their membership and their constituent groups, which in my opinion is always the most effective because these organizations already have buy-in and trust with their constituents. So that really ensures that this information will be trusted and will be utilized. So I think that's just one low-hanging fruit opportunity for us to move on relatively quickly to try to increase the overall information levels across the public about this.
Mr. Chair, Professor Sanchez, thank you so much. I think that's a really good answer, and that resonates with me because a top-down effort usually is suspect, whereas a grassroots effort coming from organizations that are not tied to any government agency are usually regarded more credible, unfortunately, and that's a fact. Now, I'm coming also from the experience I had in Hawaii, where they were doing a similar transition from fossil to renewable energy. And of course, that's a very small population contained on smaller islands. But what they did was they had a number of fairs in their parks over the weekends, generally to inform public about what this transition is going to be like and what it will mean to their lives. And that went over very well. So I'm thinking that if we can also do some outreach like that in the parks, in smaller towns, in the rural communities, and as well as the urban areas, I think that will be very effective outreach to educate our public. But the other thing was, I think I liked your infographics. I didn't look at them in much detail, but I think they convey a clear message. How can those be distributed? Through the grassroots organizations, can they use your infographics to broadcast this message?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Keel, I greatly appreciate your continued education of the insights from Hawaii. And in fact, based on one of our prior conversations, I've actually reached out to those folks and had had some information provided from them about how they went about their outreach efforts and the effectiveness of those. So thank you for that recommendation, which I've run with. I think you are very keen to think about this from a community perspective. I mean, I think whether it's done through infographics, radio messages, or the number of other opportunities to reach members of our community, I think the goal is, especially as we move beyond COVID and we can do more face-to-face community events, as you described, the more of these we do, and quickly, the better. Because I think the opportunity is now to be able to start informing the population about the upside to this and start building a coalition around support, not only for the job growth side of this, but just the environmental benefits. Fortunately, I have a lot of experience thinking about reaching a community both through social media and more old school approaches as it relates to political information. So hopefully I can be helpful in that long-term effort of finding the right path to get this information in the hands of our community members.
Mr. Chair and Professor Sanchez, I think that's a very appropriate response. I would only suggest to include the faith communities as well. I think the churches and synagogues and other places of worship can play a very important role in broadcasting this message. That would be another outlet for disseminating this information. A couple of last comments. Yeah, so this actually brings me to my more urgent question. The ETA, of course, is a longer term goal. It's easier for people to understand what it means. But what I'm really concerned about is the upcoming election will have a ballot initiative asking voters to approve or disapprove an elected or an appointed public regulatory commission. That is of urgent concern to me because the election is basically just a few weeks away. And this could have a tremendous impact on our success in implementing the ETA. So these two go hand in hand. Unless we have an informed and effective PRC, I'm really concerned that the objectives and the goals of the ETA may not be achievable in the timely manner that we want them to be achieved. Can you prepare some messaging for that as well? Because all the constituents that I've talked to, town halls that I've attended, there's been minimal understanding. In fact, people did not even know that this initiative is going to be on the ballot. And I'm also concerned that this ballot is going to be very crowded. So by the time they get to the end of that long sheet, they don't really care which box they check. And that's not an outcome that's going to be helpful for us because basically it randomizes that outcome rather. So I'm really concerned about that and I want to talk to you offline about it. So of course the ETA is of great concern. Your research has really pointed to some big holes that need to be filled. But along with that, I'm also concerned about the PRC ballot initiative. So let me speak to you of that. And thank you so much for doing such an excellent job. Of course, I'm going to be speaking more to you about it. My last question is to former Rep. McCamley. McCamley, there is a license plate in your background. What does that really say?
Mr. Chair, Representative Akil, which one are we talking about? There's two. One of them is for Everton, the football team, soccer team I support in England. The other one is for Film Las Cruces. When I was a representative, yeah, I'm back home in Las Cruces for the weekend. This is technically one of my days off, but that was for my support of the film industry when I was in the House of Representatives.
Because all I could see was the LC behind your head. So thank you so much. Well, that's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for giving me the time. And thanks a lot for both of you.
Thank you, Representative Akil. I am told Senator Cedillo Lopez has her hand up for real. Senator Cedillo Lopez.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You can't tell when it's up or down because it doesn't change colors. So I apologize if that was confusing. I just have one question for Professor Sanchez, and that is, you went through very quickly about the interest of the public in the environmental aspects. Could you, did you have any other questions about that, or could you expand more? I'm interested in knowing more about the public's view of environmental protection.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator Cedillo Lopez. I will say at the onset that the environmental aspect of the transition was not the focal point of our study. We looked mostly at jobs and the economic impacts. However, that being said, particularly in the focus groups, we heard consistently that once folks got some basic information about what this transition would look like and some of the under policies within the Energy Transition Act, they had very, very strong support of what this would mean for the environment. The public is very conscious of global warming. They were very conscious to tell us, if we weren't informed enough, that the temperature is the hottest on record at the time when we were doing our interviewing. So even if they themselves could not see the direct benefits of the jobs, they all recognize that there would be spillover benefits associated with the environmental implications of the transition away from fossil fuels. And I think the one slide that I presented was indicative of that. When we asked folks the follow-up question, what's beneficial to either you, your family, or the state, beyond the economic implications, we actually heard the environmental implications being the most positive of all the things that we tested in terms of potential messaging.
That's good to hear. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all I have.
Thank you, Senator. Next up is Senator Cervantes.
Thank you, Rich. A couple of buttons to push there. Some interesting conversations, and I wanted to follow up, though, with some thoughts. This is particularly Representative Akil and Professor Sanchez. You made some points that I think we really should talk about. They go back a little bit to the last presentation by James Jimenez, who talked about really making meaningful and genuine change that goes beyond the next election cycle and really has a clear import. So I think the ETA is misunderstood on one issue that I really want to point out. I saw earlier this week there's a very popular blogger in New Mexico. We all know who he is and know his daily blog. He was referring to the ETA and the mandates for renewable energy in the future. And then I saw the slide presentations today for the mandates and standards of renewable energy in our future too. We should be real clear for those of us that lived with the ETA, read it backwards and forwards and studied it. There are no mandates. There are no standards. When we talk about the holes in the bill, if you look at the language of the ETA, it is aspirational when we look at those higher percentages. If we hope that we're going to get there, their targets and their goals, but they're not required. And if you read the blog this week, it talks about the mandates in the future, or we see the presentation today, we see the standards, renewable standards. We want to do this. We want to get into renewable energy. We should make it a requirement, not a goal, not a hope, not a memorial, but really we should make it a law. And I think that we should be clear that the ETA really doesn't do that until you get, it does so in these early percentages. But once you start getting to the big stuff, the higher percentages, it's aspirational. And I think it's important because I'm told, I don't know whether you know Professor Sanchez or anyone on the call knows, I believe we already have a standard in place that we're supposed to have reached by 2020, by this year. And so help me, Professor, if you know what that is. If I read the blogger, and sometimes I think he's pretty accurate. So at least the version I got this week was we're supposed to be at 20% in this year in 2020 already.
20%. 20% at 2020, Senator.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you, Representative. So, well, we're in 2020. We're near the end of 2020, and the question is, are we at 20%? And if we're not, so what? I don't mean that to sound cynical, but the ETA doesn't have any consequences. And if we're supposed to be at 20% this year and we're not, what is the consequence? Well, if there are no consequences, then we're passing laws that really don't have any teeth to them at all. And we should mean it, I think. And I support this. I support the standards. I support the goals. But if we really want it to happen, we're going to have to make it a law. The ETA does not have any consequences if we don't get there. And if you don't have consequences, then you all have heard this from me many times. If you don't have consequences to a law we pass, it's a memorial. And really not much more than that. So I'm not saying the ETA is only a memorial. There's lots in there that is very strict and very firm, but when it comes to renewable standards, it's mostly aspirational. We have targets and we have goals, and without a consequence, I don't know what we're really going to accomplish there. So I want to make sure that when we talk about this, when Representative Akil and Professor Sanchez and others say the public doesn't understand it, I want to make sure we understand it before we start trying to educate the public about, or we bemoan the public doesn't understand it. We better make sure we understand it first. And I'm not sure always that we do. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Wow. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I would just note briefly that completely agree with that. And one lesson learned from my prior presentation just before this one, if the lessons learned from the State Tribal Collaboration Act are any indicator that had the same pitfalls of not having any direct enforcement or accountability. And so as I'm being asked to evaluate it, that was one of the first things I noted. So I think in general terms, I agree with you, Senator, that if there's not accountability measures put in place, how will we ever know if we reach those goals? And if we're not reaching them, how will we actually push forward?
Mr. Chairman, can I add a personal comment to that?
Sure, why not?
Why not? I mean, Senator Cervantes, I could not agree with you more. My other concern is who will be held accountable in the year 2040 or 2045? Because the way I see it, the entities we are dealing with today, especially the IOUs, may not even exist in their present configuration or business model at that time. So that is even a more fundamental question, which maybe you and I should discuss offline, but I wholeheartedly agree with you.
Right. Okay, so let's not get too far off in the weeds. Next up, we have Representative Rubio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for your presentation. I mostly just had a few comments, and this legislation, and I appreciate the chair for putting it on, was legislation that was co-sponsored by myself and Representative Martinez at the last session. And this legislation was actually brought forward by a coalition of groups from around the state who do work in communities that believe that it is necessary to be looking at transitioning away from oil and gas at some point in time. And what does that look like for workers? I think that's important to mention because while the ETA may not have mandates at this time, there are organizations and folks on the ground who are being led by communities who are pushing for legislators to actually consider what those mandates could potentially look like in the future. And I think that what Mr. Jimenez said earlier, and I want to be able to reiterate that today, is that it does take political will for us wanting to think about things in a more multi-generational kind of way versus just sort of not really seeing the bigger picture. I feel like a lot of times we lack big picture because we're just focused on what needs to be done during a legislative session. And so I welcome legislators that come back in January to listen to the folks on the ground and who are actually talking and having a lot of the discussions that came about through this survey and through this work. Lastly, I do want to say that I appreciate Gabe and all his work at the University of New Mexico, because part of the challenges that we were dealt with early on was the fact that COVID happened, and that so much of the spirit behind the study and to be able to actually, and what was the biggest flaw I think in the ETA was having that community input and having more of that community input. This study was going to allow for even a much more richer conversation, and COVID really changed that. And the fact that Gabe was able to do so much work and be able to see to be able to have so many conversations. I mean, close to 2,000 conversations beyond a person to person, which was really what the spirit of the study was. The spirit of the study was when we first started to really think about this. I think really tells us a lot, and I really appreciate Gabe's hard work on this. And again, I welcome other legislators on the committee and those who are watching, that there's a lot of really great ideas happening on the ground, that if we just listen to our constituents and listen to the folks who are really pushing these ideas, that we can actually make some multi-generational work happen. And so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Rubio. Any other questions from the members of the committee? Okay, seeing none, hearing none. I'm told we don't have anyone signed up for public comment, which means after running late, we're going to finish early, which mixed feelings about, but that's okay. Thank you, everyone, for your participation today. Thank you especially to our panelists. We have one more meeting in November, not till after the election. Look forward to seeing you all then. And thank you also to our staff for running the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the staff.
Adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, all the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee.
Hey, Representative, comment. We'll have a debate.
I'm sorry, sir?
I said stay on the coast and have a debate another hour or two. It's free.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, sir.
Matthew will sit down with us. Oh, there he goes. Bye, Matthew.
Senator,
Yeah.
the question you asked is really, really important.